The rifle barrel pressed cold against Catherine's temple as Carson Blackwood's breath reeked of whiskey and malice. "Sign over the deed, widow, or I'll make sure you join your daddy in the ground." Her fingers trembled over the parchment, one signature away from losing everything, when a quiet Boston accent cut through the darkness. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Mr. Blackwood." The frail stranger she'd planned to send away that morning now stood in the doorway, holding something that made the ruthless cattle baron go pale. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how a desperate woman's gamble on a mail-order husband became the most dangerous decision of her life, and maybe her salvation. Stay with me until the end, and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The Montana wind cut like a blade across Catherine Walker's face as she stood on the wooden platform of Copper Falls Station, her worn leather gloves clutching a faded photograph that had cost her 3 months' savings to acquire. The year was 1897, and desperation wore many faces in the dying light of the frontier, but none quite as raw as the one she saw reflected in the train's dusty windows. 27 years old and already a widow, Catherine had watched her father build the Walking W Ranch from nothing but grit and blood, only to see him die defending it from claim jumpers 2 winters past. Her husband, sweet foolish Thomas, had lasted only 8 months after that, crushed beneath a spooked horse during a spring roundup. Now the bank's foreclosure notice sat folded in her coat pocket like a death sentence, giving her 60 days to pay 3 years of accumulated debt. 60 days to save 10,000 acres. 60 days to prove she could run a ranch alone in a territory where women were expected to either remarry quickly or sell out quietly. She'd chosen a third option, one that tasted like ash in her mouth, but felt like her only chance at survival. The newspaper advertisement had been small, tucked between cattle auctions and mining claims. Professional gentlemen seeking new beginning in Western territories. Educated, hardworking, of good moral character. Will consider partnership or employment opportunities. The photograph showed a lean man with dark hair and serious eyes, dressed in a proper suit that had seen better days. His letter had been brief but articulate, mentioning a background in geology and a need to leave Boston for personal reasons that reflect no dishonor upon my character. He'd asked for train fare and the promise of honest work. Catherine had wired him both, along with a terse telegram. "Ranch needs husband. Pay is survival. Expect hard work." His response had arrived 2 days later. Arriving October 17th, "Will earn my place or leave with dignity. B. Hayes." That was 3 weeks ago. Now the train was pulling into the station, belching black smoke into the copper-colored evening sky, and Catherine felt her stomach twist with something between hope and dread. She'd told herself she was looking for a business partner, a ranch hand with legal standing to help her fight off Carson Blackwood's increasingly aggressive attempts to absorb her land into his empire. She told herself that marriage was just a formality, a legal shield in a territory where a woman's property rights evaporated like morning dew without a husband's name attached. She told herself a lot of things that felt like lies in the harsh light of reality. The train shuddered to a stop with a screech of metal on metal, and passengers began disembarking, miners with soot-stained faces, merchants with leather sample cases, a family with 3 small children who looked half-starved from the journey. Catherine scanned each face, matching them against the photograph she'd memorized down to the last detail. Then she saw him. Benjamin Hayes stepped off the train like a man walking to his own funeral, slowly, carefully, as if the ground beneath his feet might give way at any moment. He was thinner than his photograph suggested, his dark suit hanging loose on a frame that spoke of missed meals and long nights. His coat had been patched at both elbows, the repairs careful but obvious. He carried a single battered carpet bag and wore spectacles that caught the dying sunlight, making it impossible to see his eyes clearly. Catherine's heart sank like a stone in deep water. This was not the strong-backed ranch hand she'd imagined. This was not the rugged frontiersman who could stand shoulder to shoulder with her against Blackwood's hired guns. This was a scholar, a city man, someone who looked like a strong wind might blow him clear off her property and into the next county. She'd spent her last cent bringing a man west who couldn't possibly survive a single Montana winter, much less help her save a failing ranch. Benjamin stood on the platform, adjusting his spectacles with long, thin fingers that had clearly never held a branding iron or stretched barbed wire. His gaze swept across the small crowd, searching until it landed on Catherine. For a moment, neither moved. Then he picked up his bag and walked toward her with surprising steadiness. His boots, good leather but worn nearly through at the heels, clicking against the wooden planks. "Mrs. Walker?" His voice was quiet but clear, with that unmistakable Boston accent that marked him as an outsider more clearly than any sign hung around his neck. "I'm Benjamin Hayes." Up close, she could see the exhaustion carved into his face, the shadows under his eyes, the way his collar sat loose around his neck. But she could also see something else, a directness in his gaze, a stubborn set to his jaw, and hands that trembled slightly not from weakness, but from something that looked almost like determination, or perhaps barely controlled fear. "Mr. Hayes," Catherine kept her voice neutral, professional, even as disappointment crashed through her chest. "Welcome to Copper Falls. I trust your journey was tolerable." "Long," he replied, and something that might have been humor flickered across his face. "But I've endured worse." He glanced around the rough-hewn station, at the mountains rising purple and gold in the distance, at the wide, empty sky that seemed to swallow the earth whole. "Your telegram was admirably direct, Mrs. Walker. Ranch needs husband. Pay is survival. I appreciate a woman who doesn't waste words. Out here, Mr. Hayes, words are cheaper than water and less useful. I need to know if you understand what you've agreed to." Catherine gestured toward the wagon she'd left tied outside the station, its weathered wood and patched canvas cover telling their own story of hard times. "This isn't Boston. This isn't even civilization by most standards. The ranch is 20 miles from town, the work is brutal, and the nearest neighbor is Carson Blackwood, a man who spent 2 years trying to force me off my land by any means necessary." Benjamin's expression didn't change, but she saw his fingers tighten on the handle of his carpetbag. "Your letter mentioned financial difficulties and the need for legal standing. I assume that's a delicate way of saying you need a husband's name to protect your property rights." "Among other things." Catherine started walking toward the wagon, not bothering to check if he followed. "Montana Territory has its own ideas about what a woman can and cannot do. I can break horses, run cattle, and outshoot most men in the county, but I can't hold a deed without a man's signature. The bank won't extend my loan without a husband to guarantee it, and Blackwood won't stop his harassment unless he believes there's a man on my property capable of defending it." She heard Benjamin's footsteps behind her, quick and light despite his obvious fatigue. "And you thought I might be that man?" Catherine stopped beside the wagon and turned to face him, letting him see the full weight of her disappointment. "I thought you might be, yes. But I'm starting to think I made a very expensive mistake, Mr. Hayes. No offense intended, but you don't exactly look like someone who could intimidate a coyote, much less Carson Blackwood and his hired guns." For a long moment, Benjamin just looked at her. Then, to her surprise, he smiled, a tired, almost sad expression that somehow made him look older and younger at the same time. "None taken, Mrs. Walker. I'm aware of my limitations in the physical department, but if you're willing to give me 1 week, just 7 days, I believe I can prove that I'm not entirely useless. And if at the end of that time you still want to send me back to Boston, I'll go without complaint or request for compensation." "A week?" Catherine laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Mr. Hayes, I don't have a week to waste on charity cases. I have 57 days until the bank forecloses, a herd that's half the size it should be thanks to Blackwood's rustlers, and winter coming on fast. I need someone who can work, not someone who needs nursing through altitude sickness and frozen fingers." "Then don't waste time nursing me." Benjamin set down his carpetbag and held out his hand, not for her to shake but palm up, showing her the calluses that marked his fingers and the base of his thumb. "I'm not as soft as I look, Mrs. Walker. I've worked survey crews in the White Mountains, spent 2 years mapping coal deposits in Pennsylvania, and done more hard labor than you might credit. I won't match your ranch hands for speed or strength, but I won't quit either. And I might bring skills to your situation that simple muscle can't provide." Catherine stared at his hand, at the evidence of work that contradicted his scholarly appearance. Against her better judgment, she felt a small flicker of something that might have been hope. What kind of skills? Legal knowledge, geological expertise, and a fairly thorough understanding of how men like Carson Blackwood operate, the legal pressures they can apply, the weak points in their strategies, and the ways to fight back that don't involve gunfire. Benjamin lowered his hand. Your advertisement said you needed a husband, but I suspect what you really need is a partner, someone who can think as well as work. Am I wrong? You might be exactly right, or completely deluded, Catherine admitted. I haven't decided which yet. She climbed up onto the wagon seat, every muscle aching from 3 days of fence repairs she'd done herself. Get in, Mr. Hayes. You'll have your week, but I'm warning you now, if you can't pull your weight, I won't have the luxury of keeping you out of kindness. This ranch is barely surviving as it is. Benjamin loaded his carpet bag into the wagon bed and climbed up beside her with less awkwardness than she'd expected. As she snapped the reins and guided the team out of town, he sat quietly, watching the landscape unfold with an intensity that surprised her. Most city men looked overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the Western Territory, the endless sky, the brutal exposure, the sense that civilization was just a thin veneer over something wild and unforgiving. But Benjamin seemed to be cataloging everything, his eyes moving systematically across the terrain as if reading a book written in stone and sage. They rode in silence for the first hour, following the rutted road that led north into the foothills. The sun dropped toward the mountains, painting everything in shades of amber and blood. Catherine found herself stealing glances at her passenger, trying to reconcile the frail appearance with those calloused hands and that steady, analytical gaze. You said you were a geologist in Boston, she finally said, breaking the silence. What brings an educated man west with nothing but a carpetbag and a worn-out suit? Benjamin was quiet for so long that Catherine thought he might not answer. Then, I worked for Barrett Mining Company. Good position, decent pay, prospects for advancement. They sent me to evaluate potential coal deposits in western Pennsylvania. Rich seams, extremely valuable. But the land was owned by small farmers who'd been there for generations. Barrett wanted me to undervalue the deposits in my report so they could purchase the land cheaply, then discover the coal later. And you refused? I reported accurately. The farmers got fair value for their land, and I got blacklisted from every mining company on the East Coast. Benjamin's voice was matter-of-fact, without self-pity or regret. Turns out, integrity is expensive when you're dealing with men who measure success in dollars rather than dignity. I couldn't find work, couldn't pay my rent, couldn't even get hired on survey crews once word spread that I was difficult. So I came west, where maybe my past wouldn't follow quite so close. Catherine felt something shift in her chest. Not quite trust, but recognition. You picked a hard territory for a fresh start, Mr. Hayes. Montana isn't kind to outsiders, especially ones without money or connections. Neither is Boston, Benjamin replied quietly. At least here, the dangers are honest. A man knows where he stands with a blizzard or a grizzly bear. It's the civilized predators I find truly frightening, the ones who destroy you with contracts and legal maneuvers while smiling to your face. They crested a low ridge, and suddenly the ranch spread before them in the dying light. 10,000 acres of grassland and broken timber, with the main house sitting small and defiant against the vast sweep of the valley. Beyond it, a dark ridge of rock rose like a broken spine, and past that the mountains climbed toward a sky already filling with stars. That's the Walking W, Catherine said, unable to keep the pride and pain from her voice. My father built that house with his own hands, ran cattle on this land when the Blackfeet still raided settlements. He died defending it from claim jumpers 3 years ago, shot in the back by men who thought a woman couldn't possibly hold what her husband couldn't keep. I proved them wrong then. I'll prove Blackwood wrong now. Benjamin studied the ranch with that same intense focus he'd applied to the journey. How many head are you running? 243, down from 500 last spring. Blackwood's men have been cutting my fences, stampeding my herds, and outright stealing stock. I can't prove it in court. He's got the sheriff bought and paid for, but I know it's him. Catherine's hands tightened on the reins. The bank wants $3,000 by December 15th, or they're calling in the full loan. I'd need to sell off most of the herd to raise that kind of money, which would leave me with nothing to work with come spring. I'm trapped, Mr. Hayes, and Blackwood knows it. He's just waiting for the foreclosure so he can buy the place for pennies. Why does he want your land specifically? There must be a dozen other ranches he could absorb more easily. Catherine pointed toward the dark northern ridge. That rock formation. My property line runs along the base, but the ridge itself is mine. Blackwood's been trying to buy it for 2 years, offering prices that started reasonable and have gotten increasingly desperate. He claims he needs the grazing land to expand his operations, but I think there's something else. My father always said that ridge was special, that it held secrets if a man knew how to read them. She saw Benjamin's eyes narrow, his gaze locking onto the ridge with sudden sharp interest. What kind of secrets? He never said. Just called it his insurance policy against hard times. Catherine shrugged, trying to ignore the way her passenger was now staring at the rock formation, like it was written in a language only he could read. Probably just ranch talk. My father had a romantic streak, liked to think this land was blessed somehow. But blessing or curse, it's mine, and I won't let Blackwood take it. They pulled into the ranch yard as full darkness settled over the valley. The main house was modest, 4 rooms total, with a covered porch and stone chimney that her father had constructed from river rock. The barn and outbuildings were in reasonable repair, though Catherine knew every structure needed work she couldn't afford to do. 2 ranch hands emerged from the bunkhouse, both of them men past their prime, who worked for wages Catherine could barely pay. "Mrs. Walker," the older one called out. Pete Hendricks, a former cavalry scout who'd been with her father since the beginning. His eyes went straight to Benjamin with obvious skepticism. "This the fellow from Boston?" "This is Mr. Hayes," Catherine confirmed, climbing down from the wagon. "He'll be staying on trial basis. Pete, Charlie, I expect you to treat him like any other hand. No special consideration, no extra patience. He pulls his weight or he doesn't stay." Charlie Morrison, a taciturn cowboy with more scars than conversation, looked Benjamin up and down with barely concealed contempt. "You ever worked cattle, city boy?" "No," Benjamin admitted, gathering his carpetbag, "but I learned quickly, and I don't quit. Point me toward the bunkhouse and tell me what time morning chores start." 5 o'clock, Pete said, his tone slightly less hostile. "We feed stock, check fences in the near pasture, and generally do whatever Mrs. Walker needs doing. It's hard work, cold work, and we don't have time to teach you things twice." "Understood." Benjamin turned to Catherine. "Thank you for the opportunity, Mrs. Walker. I'll try to justify your investment." Catherine watched him follow Pete and Charlie toward the bunkhouse, his thin frame looking almost ghostly in the lamplight spilling from the main house. Every instinct told her she'd made a terrible mistake, that she'd wasted precious resources on a man who couldn't possibly survive the week, much less help her fight off Carson Blackwood's aggression. But there was something about Benjamin Hayes, the way he'd admitted his limitations without shame, the steadiness in his voice when he'd talked about integrity, costing him everything, the intense interest he'd shown in that northern ridge, something that made her think that maybe, just maybe, she hadn't entirely wasted her last chance at salvation. She was too tired and too worried to unpack that feeling tonight. Catherine carried her own gear into the house, lit the lamps in the small kitchen, and started heating water for coffee she couldn't really afford. Through the window, she could see lamplight in the bunkhouse and hear the low rumble of masculine voices, Pete and Charlie probably telling Benjamin exactly how little they thought of his chances. She didn't blame them. She thought pretty much the same thing herself. But as Catherine sat at her father's old table, staring at the bank foreclosure notice for the 100th time, she found herself thinking about Benjamin's hands, those long, thin fingers marked with calluses that told stories of hard work in unexpected places, about the way he'd looked at her northern ridge, as if seeing something invisible to everyone else. 7 days, she muttered to herself. God help me, I'm giving him 7 days to prove himself useful. After that, he goes back to Boston, and I'll figure something else out. Maybe rob a bank. Couldn't possibly make things worse than they already are. The coffee boiled over, and Catherine cursed softly as she moved the pot off the heat. Outside, the Montana night pressed against the windows with all its vast, indifferent weight. Somewhere out there, Carson Blackwood was probably laughing into his expensive whiskey, counting the days until he could add the walking W to his empire. Somewhere in Boston, the Barrett Mining Company was probably still blacklisting honest men who refused to cheat farmers. And somewhere in her bunkhouse, a frail scholar with patched elbows and tired eyes was probably wondering what fresh hell he'd stumbled into by answering her advertisement. Catherine poured her coffee and raised the tin cup in a bitter toast to her own desperate choices. "Welcome to Montana, Mr. Hayes. I hope you survive long enough to regret coming here." The wind answered with a low moan that might have been agreement or warning. In the darkness beyond her porch, the northern ridge loomed like a sleeping giant, keeping whatever secrets her father had seen in its ancient stone. And in the bunkhouse, Benjamin Hayes lay awake on a narrow cot, his mind already working through equations of rock density and geological formation, while his body ached with exhaustion and something that felt dangerously close to hope. Neither of them knew it yet, but they'd made a bargain that would change everything, for better or worse, in ways neither could possibly predict. The real story was just beginning. Dawn came cold and merciless at 4:30 the next morning, dragging Catherine from 3 hours of restless sleep. She dressed in the darkness, thick canvas pants, flannel shirt, wool coat, and boots that had been resoled twice, and headed out to start the day's work before Pete and Charlie roused the new hire from whatever dreams troubled city men in the wilderness. She was halfway to the barn when she saw lamplight already burning in the bunkhouse, and a lean figure moving purposefully in the pre-dawn gloom. Benjamin Hayes was not only awake, he was dressed, booted, and standing beside the woodpile with an axe in his hands, clearly trying to figure out the proper stance for splitting logs. Catherine stopped in her tracks, surprised enough that she forgot the bitter cold for a moment. The man looked like he'd barely slept, his face drawn and his spectacles slightly askew, but he was out there working while most ranch hands would still be cursing the dawn. She walked over quietly, watching him position a log on the chopping block with more care than skill. His first swing was tentative and poorly aimed, glancing off the wood without making much impression. His second was better, finding the grain, though it took him 4 more attempts to actually split the piece. "You're up early," Catherine said, making him jump slightly, "and you're holding that axe wrong." Benjamin straightened, breathing hard from the exertion. "I was hoping to have the morning wood split before anyone noticed my incompetence. Obviously, that plan failed." He looked at the axe in his hands with something between frustration and determination. "Could you show me the right way? I'd rather learn properly than develop bad habits." Against her better judgment, Catherine felt a smile tugging at her lips. "Most men would be too proud to ask." "Here." She took the axe and demonstrated the proper stance, the way to swing from the hips rather than the shoulders, how to aim for the grain and let the weight of the blade do the work. It's not about strength as much as technique and patience. Let the axe fall with its own momentum. She handed it back and watched as Benjamin tried again, adjusting his stance based on her instruction. This time, the log split cleanly, and she saw something like satisfaction flicker across his exhausted face. "Better," Catherine admitted, "but you'll get blisters if you work without gloves. Come inside. I'll find you a pair before Pete and Charlie wake up and see you destroying my woodpile." They walked to the main house together, their breath misting in the cold air. Inside, Catherine lit the stove and started coffee while Benjamin waited by the door, clearly uncertain about the propriety of being alone with her in the pre-dawn darkness. "Relax, Mr. Hayes. I'm not worried about scandal, and neither is anyone else out here. The rules are different when survival trumps propriety." Catherine found a pair of her father's old work gloves and tossed them to him. "These should fit. Wear them until you develop proper calluses." "Thank you." Benjamin studied the gloves, his expression difficult to read in the lamplight. "Mrs. Walker, I want to be honest with you about something. I know I'm not what you expected when you sent for a mail-order husband. I know I look insufficient for the work ahead, but I'm not here to waste your time or take advantage of your situation. I genuinely believe I can help you save this ranch, though probably not in the ways you originally envisioned." Catherine poured 2 cups of coffee and slid one across the table toward him. "That's a bold claim for a man who can barely split firewood. What exactly do you think you can do that Pete and Charlie can't?" Benjamin accepted the coffee gratefully, warming his hands on the cup. "Blackwood is using legal and economic pressure to force you out, correct? Stolen cattle, cut fences, intimidation tactics that fall just short of prosecutable crimes. He's being careful because outright violence would bring federal attention. Montana Territory still has marshals who take claim jumping seriously, especially against widows. But economic warfare is harder to prove, easier to disguise as business competition. All of which I already know, Catherine said impatiently. What's your point? My point is that Blackwood has weaknesses too, legal vulnerabilities. His operation is large enough that it requires contracts, property deeds, water rights, grazing permits, all documented, all potentially challengeable. I'm not a lawyer, but I know how to read land surveys and geological reports. I know how to find discrepancies in property boundaries and water rights. And I'm very, very good at making legal headaches for men who think they're untouchable. Catherine felt something stir in her chest. Not hope exactly, but curiosity. You think you can find something in Blackwood's paperwork, some legal wedge we can use? I think it's worth looking, but I'll need access to property records, water rights documentation, mineral survey reports, anything that might show where his claims overlap with yours or where he's overextended himself legally. Benjamin met her gaze steadily over the rim of his cup. In the meantime, I'll work. I'll learn to chop wood properly and mend fences and whatever else needs doing. I may not be the husband you wanted, Mrs. Walker, but I can be the partner you need, if you're willing to trust me that far. Catherine studied him in the lamplight, this thin, exhausted scholar with his patched coat and quiet determination. Every practical instinct told her to send him back to Boston on the next train, to cut her losses and focus on fighting Blackwood with the resources she actually had, rather than wasting time on maybes and possibilities. But something in Benjamin's eyes reminded her of her father, that stubborn refusal to accept defeat, that willingness to fight with whatever weapons came to hand, legal or otherwise. And God knew she needed any advantage she could get. All right, she heard herself say. You've got your week, Mr. Hayes, but I'm watching you. If you can't pull your weight physically while you're playing lawyer in your spare time, the deal's off. Understood? Perfectly. Benjamin stood, setting down his empty cup with care. Thank you for the coffee and the gloves. I should get back to the woodpile before Pete and Charlie wake up. First impressions matter, even among ranch hands. He left before Catherine could respond, slipping out into the cold dawn with his borrowed gloves and his impossible confidence. She stood alone in her kitchen, holding her father's old coffee cup, feeling like she'd just made another gamble she couldn't afford. But gambling was all she had left. That and 56 days until the bank came for her land. Through the window, she could see Benjamin working the axe with improved technique, his thin frame silhouetted against the lightening sky. Wood split and fell, steadily if not quickly, while the ranch hands began stirring in the bunkhouse and the day's brutal work approached like a storm gathering over distant mountains. Catherine finished her coffee and went to face it head-on, the way she'd faced every challenge since her father died, with gritted teeth, bleeding hands, and a prayer that somehow, impossibly, she'd find a way to survive one more day. She just hoped Benjamin Hayes lasted long enough to either prove himself useful or prove her right about sending him away. Either way, the story was far from over. Benjamin Hayes lasted 3 days before Catherine started to believe he might actually survive the week. Not comfortably, not without visible pain, but with a grim determination that surprised even Pete Hendricks, who'd spent 40 years judging men by how they handled hardship. He's tougher than he looks, Pete admitted on the third evening, watching Benjamin limp toward the bunkhouse after 12 hours of stringing barbed wire along the eastern fence line. Saw him slice his hand open on the wire this morning, bled like a stuck pig, but he just wrapped it in his handkerchief and kept working. Didn't complain once. Catherine had noticed. She'd also noticed the way Benjamin studied the land with that intense geological focus, the way his gaze kept drifting toward the northern ridge whenever he thought no one was watching, and the way he spent his evenings in the bunkhouse with a stub of pencil and scraps of paper, sketching something by lamplight. On the fourth morning, she found him in the barn before dawn, not splitting wood this time, but examining the foundation stones with his spectacles pushed up on his forehead and his fingers tracing the rock surface like he was reading Braille. "Looking for something specific, Mr. Hayes?" Catherine asked, startling him badly enough that he nearly dropped his lantern. "Mrs. Walker." Benjamin straightened, his face flushing slightly. "I was just... The foundation stones caught my attention. They're not local granite, they're limestone, probably quarried from somewhere along that northern ridge. Your father must have hauled them down specifically for this construction." "So?" Catherine crossed her arms, genuinely curious despite her suspicion. "What does the type of stone matter?" "Limestone is sedimentary. It forms in layers over millions of years, usually in areas that were once underwater, and it often occurs alongside other sedimentary deposits, sandstone, shale. Benjamin paused, choosing his words carefully. Coal. Catherine felt something cold slide down her spine. You think there's coal on my land? I think there might be. The geological indicators are promising. The ridge formation, the limestone deposits, the way the rock layers are tilted. But I'd need to examine the ridge itself to be certain, and I didn't want to presume permission to explore your property without asking first. For a long moment, Catherine just stared at him, her mind racing through implications she wasn't sure she wanted to face. Coal meant money, potentially enormous amounts of money, enough to pay off the bank and then some. But it also meant exactly the kind of prize that would explain Carson Blackwood's obsessive interest in her land, his increasingly desperate offers to buy the ridge, his willingness to use illegal tactics to force her out. My father knew, she said quietly. He must have known, or at least suspected. That's what he meant about the ridge being his insurance policy. It's possible. Benjamin's voice was gentle, understanding. But we won't know for certain without a proper survey. I could do a preliminary examination, test the rock layers, look for visible coal seams, assess the quality and quantity. If there is coal there, and if it's valuable enough, it might give us leverage against Blackwood. At the very least, it would explain his behavior. Catherine walked to the barn door and looked out at the pre-dawn darkness, at the shadow of the northern ridge rising against the stars. Everything in her wanted to ride up there immediately, to confirm or deny the possibility that had just taken root in her chest. But years of hard experience had taught her caution. If Blackwood even suspects you're surveying for coal, he'll move against us directly. He's been careful so far because he thinks time is on his side. Why risk federal attention when he can just wait for the bank to foreclose? But if he thinks we might discover something valuable enough to save the ranch, he won't wait anymore. Then we'll have to be discreet. Benjamin turned back to the limestone foundation, running his fingers across the stone one more time. I can go up to the ridge on the pretense of checking fence lines or looking for stray cattle. If anyone asks, I'm just the new ranch hand learning the property boundaries. No one needs to know I'm looking for anything specific. Except Pete and Charlie. They'll know something strange if you start chipping rock samples and taking measurements. Then we tell them the truth, or part of it, that I'm concerned about the ridge's geological stability, making sure there's no risk of rock slides that could threaten the ranch buildings or endanger cattle. It's not entirely a lie, and it gives me reason to examine the formation closely. Catherine turned back to face him, studying this unlikely partner with new eyes. 4 days ago, he'd stepped off a train looking like he might collapse from exhaustion at any moment. Now he stood in her barn at dawn, calmly proposing a covert geological survey that could either save her ranch or get them both killed, and somehow making it sound almost reasonable. You've thought this through, she observed. I've had a lot of time to think these past few nights. Stringing barbed wire is an intellectually demanding work. It leaves the mind free to wander. Benjamin's slight smile was wry, acknowledging both his physical limitations and his determination to compensate for them. Mrs. Walker, I know you're taking an enormous risk trusting me. I know I haven't proven myself yet beyond showing I can bleed just as well as the next man. But this, geological analysis, property evaluation, finding the leverage you need against Blackwood, this is what I'm actually good at. Let me do what I came here to do. Before Catherine could respond, they heard voices outside, Pete and Charlie emerging from the bunkhouse, beginning another day's work. The moment for private conversation had passed. This afternoon, Catherine said quietly, we'll ride up to check the northern fence line. Bring whatever tools you need for your survey, but keep them subtle. And Mr. Hayes? If this goes wrong, if Blackwood finds out what we're doing, things will get very ugly very fast. Are you prepared for that? Benjamin met her gaze without flinching. I lost everything in Boston for telling the truth about coal deposits, Mrs. Walker. I'm not afraid of ugly. I'm afraid of letting corruption win because good people were too cautious to fight back. Catherine found herself nodding, feeling something shift between them. Not quite trust yet, but the foundation for it. All right then. Welcome to the real fight, Mr. Hayes. Try not to get us both killed on your first survey. She left him in the barn and went to face the day's work, her mind already racing ahead to the afternoon, to the ridge, to the possibility that everything might be about to change. For better or worse, She'd cast her lot with the frail scholar from Boston. Now she just had to hope his geological expertise was as good as his determination. The morning crawled past with agonizing slowness. Catherine worked alongside Pete and Charlie, repairing a section of corral fence that had been mysteriously damaged during the night. Another small act of sabotage from Blackwood's hired hands, though nothing she could prove in court. Benjamin worked with them, his movements still awkward but improving daily, his bandaged hand gripping the hammer with stubborn competence despite obvious pain. Around noon, 3 riders appeared on the southern horizon, moving toward the ranch with casual arrogance that made Catherine's stomach knot. She recognized the lead horse even at a distance, a flashy paint gelding that belonged to Carson Blackwood himself. "Company coming," Pete muttered, his hand dropping automatically to the rifle propped against the fence post. "Should I get the others?" "No, let's not escalate unless he forces us to." Catherine wiped sweat from her forehead and walked toward the house, willing her heart to slow down. Blackwood had visited twice before, always polite on the surface, always threatening underneath. She'd handled him both times without violence, though it had taken every ounce of self-control she possessed. Benjamin appeared at her elbow, quiet as a shadow. "The man on the paint horse? That's Blackwood?" "That's him. Stay behind me, keep your mouth shut, and don't do anything that might give him an excuse to start trouble." Catherine checked the small revolver tucked into her belt, more for reassurance than any real belief she'd use it. "He's dangerous, Mr. Hayes. Not because he's fast with a gun, he pays other men to do that work, but because he's smart and connected and completely without conscience." Carson Blackwood dismounted in the ranch yard with the easy grace of a man who'd spent his whole life in the saddle. He was 45, handsome in a hard-edged way, dressed in clothes that cost more than most ranch hands earned in a year. His 2 companions were hired guns, their purpose obvious from the way they wore their weapons and the cold assessment in their eyes. "Catherine," Blackwood smiled, tipping his expensive hat, "looking lovely as ever, despite the circumstances. I heard you'd acquired some new help. Thought I'd ride over and meet the fellow properly." "Mr. Blackwood." Catherine kept her voice neutral, professional. "This is Benjamin Hayes, recently arrived from Boston. Mr. Hayes, this is Carson Blackwood, owner of the Double B Ranch." Benjamin nodded acknowledgement but didn't offer his hand, reading the situation with surprising accuracy. "Mr. Blackwood?" Blackwood's eyes swept over Benjamin with barely concealed contempt, taking in the thin frame, the patched clothing, the obvious exhaustion. "Boston, eh? Long way to come for ranch work. What brings a city fellow to our rough territory, Mr. Hayes?" "Opportunity," Benjamin replied quietly, "and a preference for honest work over dishonest compromise." The words hung in the air like a challenge, subtle enough to deny but clear enough to sting. Catherine saw Blackwood's smile tighten fractionally, saw one of the hired guns shift his weight, and felt her pulse spike with alarm. "Interesting philosophy," Blackwood said, his tone sharpening, "though I've found that honesty is a luxury most men can't afford when survival is at stake. Wouldn't you agree, Catherine? All this stubborn pride of yours, this refusal to accept my perfectly reasonable offers, where has it gotten you? 53 days from foreclosure, from what I hear." 53 days until you lose everything your father built." 53 days to find another solution," Catherine corrected, keeping her voice steady despite the rage building in her chest. "My answer hasn't changed, Mr. Blackwood. The Walking W isn't for sale, not to you or anyone else. Not at any price." "Even when the alternative is complete ruin?" Blackwood's voice turned silky, dangerous. "Catherine, be reasonable. I'm offering you a way out with some dignity and tact. Sell me the ranch. I'll give you fair market value, enough to start fresh somewhere else. Oregon, perhaps, or California. Somewhere without quite so many complications." "Like stolen cattle and cut fences?" The words escaped before Catherine could stop them, sharp and accusatory. "Like mysterious accidents that seem to happen only to my property? Those kinds of complications, Mr. Blackwood?" The pretense of friendliness dropped from Blackwood's face like a discarded mask. "Careful, Catherine. Accusations without proof are dangerous. Almost as dangerous as refusing help from the only man with resources enough to save you." He glanced at Benjamin with naked disdain. "You think this Boston scholar is going to protect you? You think a man who can barely swing an axe is going to stand between you and reality? I think Mr. Hayes is none of your concern, Catherine said coldly, and I think you've said your piece. Thank you for stopping by, but we have work to do. Blackwood didn't move. Instead, he turned his full attention to Benjamin, studying him with the calculating intensity of a predator sizing up potential prey. You seem like an educated man, Mr. Hayes. Surely you can see the mathematics of this situation. Mrs. Walker is drowning in debt with no realistic way to recover. The bank will foreclose in less than 2 months. She'll lose everything regardless. The only question is whether she loses it with a few $1,000s in her pocket or completely destitute. What would an educated man advise in such circumstances? Benjamin looked back at Blackwood with an expression that gave nothing away. An educated man would advise examining all the variables before accepting defeat. Mathematics only works when you have complete data, Mr. Blackwood. Mrs. Walker may have options you're not aware of. Such as? Blackwood's voice dropped to something dangerous. A miraculous gold strike? A wealthy benefactor appearing from nowhere? Perhaps you're that benefactor, Mr. Hayes? Hidden wealth beneath those patched sleeves? Perhaps simply better management and legal review of property rights, Benjamin replied calmly. I've found that many seemingly impossible situations become solvable when examined by fresh eyes with proper expertise. For a moment, Catherine thought Blackwood might actually strike him. She saw the rage flicker across the older man's face, saw his hand twitch toward his belt, and she moved instinctively to put herself between them. But Blackwood mastered himself with visible effort, stepping back and producing that cold smile again. I see. You found yourself a champion, Catherine, or at least someone willing to go down with your sinking ship. How romantic. He turned toward his horse, then paused. 53 days, Mrs. Walker. When the bank comes calling and your Boston friend's expertise fails to produce miracles, remember that I offered you a dignified exit. What happens after that will be on your own head. He mounted smoothly and wheeled his horse around. His hired guns followed, and within moments they were riding south toward the Double B, leaving silence in their wake. Catherine realized she was shaking, not from fear, but from fury so intense it made her vision blur. God damn him. God damn his arrogance and his threats and his smug certainty that I'll just roll over and surrender. He's afraid, Benjamin said quietly, startling her. Did you notice? Beneath all that bluster and intimidation, he's genuinely concerned. That comment about fresh eyes with proper expertise, it rattled him. He knows something about your land that he doesn't want discovered, and now he's worried you might have brought in someone capable of finding it. You baited him deliberately, Catherine turned to stare at Benjamin, seeing him with new comprehension. You wanted him nervous. Why? Because nervous men make mistakes. Confident men are patient. They wait for victory to come to them. But frightened men act rashly, overreach, expose themselves. Benjamin adjusted his spectacles, his hand trembling slightly from the confrontation's aftermath. If Blackwood believes we're close to discovering something valuable, he'll either make a desperate move or reveal what he's really after. Either way, we learn more about his true intentions. Or he decides to eliminate the threat before we can find anything. Catherine's voice was harsh. You just painted a target on both our backs, Mr. Hayes. He won't wait 53 days now. He'll move against us directly, and soon. Then we'd better complete that survey quickly. Benjamin's jaw set with stubborn determination. This afternoon, like you planned, we need to know what's on that ridge before Blackwood forces our hand. Pete and Charlie approached cautiously, clearly having watched the entire confrontation from a careful distance. Mrs. Walker, Pete said, his weathered face grim. That was about as ugly as I've seen Blackwood get without actually drawing iron. You all right? I'm fine. Angry, but fine. Catherine took a breath, forcing herself to think tactically rather than emotionally. Pete, I need you and Charlie to keep watch this afternoon. Anyone approaches the ranch, I want to know immediately. Fire 3 shots if there's trouble. Mr. Hayes and I are riding up to check the northern fence line. Pete's eyes narrowed. Just the 2 of you? That's pretty isolated country up there, ma'am. If Blackwood's men decide to make trouble, then we'll handle it. But I don't think they'll move that fast. They're still playing the long game, trying to avoid attention from federal marshals. An attack this soon after Blackwood's visit would be too obvious. Catherine hoped she sounded more confident than she felt. "We'll be back before dark. If we're not, come looking." She left them to their duties and went to saddle her horse, a tough little sorrel mare named Ruby, who'd carried her through 3 Montana winters. Benjamin followed, moving with the careful stiffness of someone whose muscles were still adjusting to ranch work. "Can you ride?" Catherine asked, realizing she'd never actually seen him on a horse. "After a fashion. I won't win any races, but I can stay in the saddle." Benjamin eyed the horses with something between respect and trepidation. "I learned on a geological survey crew in Vermont. The horses were very patient with incompetence, which I hope your animals share." Catherine found herself almost smiling despite the tension. "Take Duke, the gray gelding in the 3rd stall. He's older, steady, won't spook easily. And for God's sake, don't fall off and break something. I can't afford to lose my surveyor before we even reach the ridge." They rode out 30 minutes later, Catherine on Ruby and Benjamin aboard Duke, with a canvas satchel of tools slung across his saddle. The day had turned beautiful despite everything. Crisp autumn air, golden light slanting across the grassland, mountains rising purple and magnificent against an impossible blue sky. Under different circumstances, it would have been the kind of ride Catherine loved, the kind that reminded her why she fought so hard to keep this land. Instead, she found herself constantly scanning the horizon for watchers, for any sign that Blackwood's men were tracking them, for the glint of sunlight on rifle barrels that would mean they'd walked into an ambush. Benjamin rode beside her in silence, his attention divided between staying mounted and studying the approaching ridge with increasing intensity. As they climbed higher, the rock formation revealed itself in greater detail. Dark stone jutting from the earth like broken teeth, stratified layers tilted at sharp angles, exposed faces where erosion had stripped away softer material. "There," Benjamin said suddenly, pointing. "See those black streaks in the upper layers? That's coal outcropping, exposed seams where the deposit comes close to the surface. And look at the angle of the beds, the way they're tilted. This isn't some shallow deposit, Mrs. Walker. If what I'm seeing is accurate, this could be a major field." Catherine stared at the ridge with new eyes, seeing not just rock, but possibility, salvation or damnation depending on how the next few hours played out. "How can you tell how much is there?" "I can't, not with certainty, but I can make educated estimates based on the visible outcroppings, the geological structure, the quality of the exposed coal." Benjamin dismounted with visible relief, nearly stumbling as his legs adjusted to solid ground again. "I'll need to take samples, test the rock layers, do some basic measurements. It'll take a few hours if we're thorough." "Do what you need to do. I'll keep watch." Catherine pulled her rifle from its saddle scabbard and found a position with clear sight lines across the valley below. From up here, she could see her ranch spread out like a map, could see the smoke rising from the bunkhouse chimney, could even make out the tiny figures of Pete and Charlie moving between buildings. She could also see riders in the distance, too far to identify, but heading in a direction that might be toward the Double B or might be toward her northern fence line. Her stomach knotted with fresh tension. Benjamin worked with surprising speed and efficiency. No longer the awkward city man, but a trained professional in his element. He chipped samples from different layers, examined them with a small magnifying glass, made careful notes in a leather-bound journal. He measured angles with a brass surveyor's compass, sketched cross-sections of the rock face, and periodically stepped back to study the larger formation with narrowed eyes. Catherine watched him work, watched the transformation that came over him when he was doing what he'd been trained for. This was Benjamin Hayes, the geologist, the man who'd been blacklisted for refusing to lie about coal deposits in Pennsylvania. The man who saw truth in stone layers the way other men read books. "It's anthracite," he said finally, his voice tight with controlled excitement. "High-grade, clean-burning, extremely valuable. Based on the outcropping pattern and the geological structure, I estimate the seam extends at least several hundred yards into the ridge, possibly much further. Mrs. Walker, this isn't a minor deposit. This is the kind of discovery that builds fortunes." Catherine felt the world tilt sideways, felt hope and terror crash together in her chest. "How much? If we could mine it properly, how much money are we talking about?" Benjamin did calculations in his journal, his pencil scratching quickly across the page. Conservative estimate. If properly developed, this deposit could be worth $50,000. Possibly twice that if the seam extends as far as I suspect, and the quality remains consistent. He looked up at her, his expression grave. This is why Blackwood wants your land. This is what your father must have known or suspected. And this is why you're in much more danger than you realized. $50,000. The number was so large it felt unreal, like something from a fever dream. Catherine could pay off the bank, rebuild her herd, hire proper ranch hands, maybe even expand operations. She could secure the walking W for generations, could honor her father's legacy with success instead of desperate survival, if she lived long enough to claim it. Blackwood will kill us for this, she said flatly. If he even suspects we've confirmed the deposit, he won't wait for legal mechanisms. He'll burn us out or shoot us down and claim self-defense afterward. The sheriff's bought. No one will investigate too carefully. Then we need to move first. Benjamin closed his journal and tucked it carefully into his satchel. We need to file a mineral claim with the territorial office in Helena. Once it's officially registered in your name, Blackwood can't simply take the land and develop it himself. He'd be fighting federal mining law, not just a widow's property rights. Helena is 3 days' ride from here. We'd have to leave immediately, travel fast, and hope Blackwood doesn't realize what we're doing until it's too late. Catherine's mind raced through logistics, dangers, possibilities. And we'd have to leave the ranch undefended while we're gone. Pete and Charlie are good men, but they're not gunfighters. If Blackwood moves against them... She never finished the sentence. The crack of a rifle shot echoed across the valley, then 2 more in rapid succession. The warning signal she'd told Pete to use if trouble approached. Catherine was moving before the echo faded, vaulting onto Ruby's back with practiced speed. Ride! Now! Benjamin scrambled aboard Duke with less grace but equal urgency. They plunged down the slope at a dangerous pace, rocks scattering under the horses' hooves, the ridge falling away behind them as they raced toward whatever crisis was unfolding at the ranch. Catherine's heart hammered against her ribs as they galloped across the grassland, her rifle gripped in one hand and the reins in the other. Behind them, the coal deposit waited in silent patience, its dark seams holding secrets that might save them or might be the reason they died this afternoon. Either way, the time for caution had ended. The fight Carson Blackwood had been building toward for 2 years was about to explode into the open, and Catherine had no choice but to meet it head-on with a frail scholar from Boston as her unlikely partner and $50,000 worth of coal as the prize neither of them might survive to claim. The real war had finally begun. They crested the final rise to see the ranch yard in chaos. 6 riders surrounded the main house, their horses stamping and blowing while Pete and Charlie stood backed against the barn wall, hands raised, Charlie's rifle lying useless in the dirt at his feet. Catherine recognized 3 of the men as Blackwood's hired guns, but the others were strangers, hard-faced drifters with the look of men paid to do violence without asking questions. The leader sat his horse with casual arrogance, a Winchester rifle resting across his saddle, and Catherine's blood went cold as she recognized Jake Murdoch, the most notorious hired gun in Montana territory. Blackwood had escalated far beyond intimidation. He'd brought in a killer. "Hold up," Benjamin said quietly, his hand catching Catherine's arm as she started to spur Ruby forward. "Charging in won't help Pete and Charlie. We need to think." "There's nothing to think about. Those are my men, my property." Catherine's voice shook with rage and fear in equal measure. "I won't let Murdoch hurt them because I'm not there. And you won't help them by getting shot before you reach the yard." Benjamin's grip tightened. "Look, Murdoch is positioned to see anyone approaching from this direction. He's got men covering both flanks. This isn't random harassment, Mrs. Walker. This is a planned operation and they're waiting for something. Probably for us." Catherine forced herself to stop, to breathe, to think past the panic screaming through her veins. Benjamin was right. Murdoch hadn't positioned his men defensively, but as a trap. The moment she and Benjamin rode into the yard, they'd be surrounded with no cover and no chance to fight back. Which meant this wasn't about scaring her anymore. This was about eliminating her entirely. "Blackwood knows," she said, the realization settling like ice in her stomach. "He knows we went up to survey the ridge. He's moving now because he can't afford to let us file that mineral claim. Then we need to get to Helena before he can stop us." Benjamin's voice was steady despite the fear Catherine could see in his eyes. We can't help Pete and Charlie by getting ourselves killed, but if we can reach the territorial office, file the claim officially, we might be able to bring federal pressure to bear. Marshals take claim jumping seriously, especially when it involves documented mineral rights. That means abandoning my men to those animals, leaving them at Murdoch's mercy while we run. The words tasted like poison in Catherine's mouth. Pete had been with her father since the beginning, had taught her to ride and shoot, had stayed loyal through poverty and danger. And Charlie, taciturn Charlie, who never complained and never asked for more than fair wages, she couldn't just leave them to whatever fate Blackwood had planned. We're not abandoning them. We're giving them a chance. Benjamin pulled out his journal and tore a page free, writing quickly. If we can reach Helena, file the claim, and bring back federal authority, Blackwood can't simply kill them and hide the evidence. He'd be fighting the U.S. government, not just a widow rancher. It's their best chance, Mrs. Walker. Maybe their only chance. Catherine wanted to argue, wanted to reject the cold mathematics of survival that Benjamin was presenting. But she'd run a failing ranch for 3 years, had made a dozen impossible choices that required sacrificing short-term comfort for long-term survival. She knew he was right, even as everything in her screamed to charge down that slope and fight regardless of the odds. How do we get past them? Murdoch's men will see us if we try to circle around toward Helena. Benjamin was already dismounting, securing his journal and tools. We go through the high country, up and over the ridge, then down the western slope to pick up the Helena road beyond Blackwood's territory. It'll add half a day to the journey, but it keeps us out of sight. Once we're clear, we ride hard and don't stop until we reach the territorial office. That route goes through rough country, no trails, no water sources, and early snow at the higher elevations. Catherine dismounted as well, her mind already mapping the treacherous path Benjamin was proposing. And Duke won't make it. He's too old for that kind of climbing. Then I'll walk when I have to and ride when I can. Benjamin's jaw set with determination. Mrs. Walker, I didn't come west to live comfortably. I came to fight back against men like Barrett Mining and Carson Blackwood. If that means walking through snow until my feet bleed, so be it. We're doing this. Catherine looked down at the ranch one more time, at Pete and Charlie standing defiant despite being outnumbered and outgunned, at the buildings her father had constructed with his own hands, at the land she'd sworn to protect no matter the cost. Then she looked at Benjamin Hayes, this unlikely partner who'd survived 5 days of brutal ranch work despite being completely unprepared for it, who'd baited Blackwood deliberately to force a confrontation, who was now proposing a dangerous mountain crossing with the same calm focus he'd applied to surveying coal deposits. All right, she said quietly, we go over the ridge. But Mr. Hayes, if you slow me down, if you can't keep pace, then leave me and continue alone. The claim is what matters. Getting the legal protection before Blackwood can consolidate his position. Benjamin checked his satchel one final time, securing the journal with its damning geological findings. I understand the stakes, Mrs. Walker. I won't be the reason this fails. They led the horses up the slope at an angle that kept them below the ridgeline, out of sight from the ranch below. Catherine's mind churned with contingency plans and terrible possibilities. If Murdoch hurt Pete or Charlie, if Blackwood burned the buildings or slaughtered the cattle, if federal marshals didn't care enough to investigate. So many ways this could go catastrophically wrong. So many reasons to turn back and fight now, regardless of the odds. But Benjamin was right. The claim was everything. Without official mineral rights, she had nothing but a failing ranch and unpayable debt. With the claim filed and documented, she had legal standing that even Blackwood's corruption couldn't easily overcome. It was cold mathematics, brutal pragmatism, and it felt like betraying every loyal impulse she possessed. The climb grew steeper as they moved higher, the horses scrambling over loose rock and exposed roots. Catherine led the way with the confidence of someone who'd ridden this land for 27 years, finding the faint game trails that offered the easiest passage. Behind her, Benjamin struggled but never complained. His breathing labored in the thinning air, but his pace steady. They reached the ridge crest as sunset painted the sky in shades of blood and gold. Below them, the ranch looked impossibly small and vulnerable, smoke rising from the bunkhouse chimney into the gathering dusk. Catherine could still see the riders in the yard, could imagine Pete and Charlie enduring Murdoch's threats and intimidation, and guilt crashed over her like a physical weight. "We'll come back," Benjamin said quietly, understanding without being told. "We'll file the claim, bring federal authority, and make Blackwood pay for every moment of this. I promise you that, Mrs. Walker. This isn't retreat. This is tactical positioning for a war we intend to win." Catherine nodded, not trusting her voice, and turned Ruby toward the western slope. The descent was even more treacherous than the climb, loose scree sliding beneath the horses' hooves, deadfall timber creating obstacles they had to pick through carefully. By the time they reached more level ground, full darkness had fallen and the temperature had dropped sharply. "We can't risk a fire," Catherine said, scanning the terrain for a place to rest. "Blackwood might have men searching for us, and any light would be visible for miles." They made cold camp in a sheltered draw, tying the horses where they could graze on what sparse grass remained this late in the season. Catherine broke out the dried beef and hardtack she kept in her saddlebags for emergencies, dividing it equally despite Benjamin's protest that she should take the larger share. "We're partners now," she said firmly. "Partners share equally, good times and bad. Besides, you'll need your strength for tomorrow. The easy part is over." Benjamin managed a tired smile. "If that was the easy part, I'm genuinely concerned about what you consider difficult." He ate slowly, clearly exhausted, but still alert, still thinking. "When we reach Helena, how quickly can we file the claim?" "Assuming we arrive during business hours and the territorial office is open. An hour, maybe less. We'll need to present the survey findings, mark the boundaries on the official map, pay the filing fee, and get the documentation registered." Catherine wrapped her coat tighter against the cold. "The filing fee is $20. I have $30 in my emergency fund, hidden in my father's old Bible back at the ranch. I brought it with me in case of exactly this situation. Then we file tomorrow, rest the horses for a few hours, and ride straight back with the documentation. Once we have that paperwork in hand, Blackwood's position becomes significantly more complicated." Benjamin was quiet for a moment, then added, "Mrs. Walker, I need to tell you something. When we file this claim, when we make this official, you should file it in your name alone. Not as a married couple, not as partners, just you." Catherine turned to stare at him in the darkness. "What are you talking about? We're doing this together. The claim should reflect that. If the claim is filed jointly and something happens to me, if Blackwood's men catch up to us, if we run into trouble on the way back, you don't want legal complications about ownership. Your name alone makes it simple, clear, uncontestable." Benjamin's voice was matter-of-fact, discussing his potential death with the same calm he'd used to analyze rock formations. "Besides, it's your land, your father's legacy. I'm just the surveyor who confirmed what you already suspected. You're more than that and you know it." Catherine felt something fierce stir in her chest. "You rode into this territory with nothing but a carpetbag and a blacklisted reputation. You've worked yourself half to death trying to prove your worth on my ranch. You deliberately baited Blackwood to force his hand, and now you're proposing we cross hostile territory to file a claim that might get us both killed. That's not just a surveyor, Mr. Hayes. That's a partner who deserves equal recognition. Then consider this my investment in the partnership, geological expertise in exchange for legal protection when I needed a fresh start." Benjamin's tone gentled slightly. "Mrs. Walker, I appreciate the sentiment, truly, but I'm a practical man. The smartest tactical decision is to file in your name alone and avoid any potential complications. We can negotiate profit-sharing arrangements later when we're not running for our lives from hired killers." Catherine wanted to argue further, but exhaustion was pulling at her like a riptide, and she knew Benjamin was probably right about the tactical advantages of simple ownership. "Fine. My name alone on the claim, but you get 20% of whatever we make from that deposit, Mr. Hayes. That's non-negotiable. You found it, you confirmed it, you're risking your life for it. 20%. 5% would be more than generous. 20% or I ride to Helena alone right now, and you can walk back to Boston." Catherine's voice hardened with finality. "I'm serious, Mr. Hayes. I won't profit from your expertise and your courage without fair compensation. 20% or no deal." Benjamin was quiet so long she thought he might actually refuse. Then he laughed, a quiet sound that held equal parts exhaustion and genuine amusement. "You're possibly the most stubborn woman I've ever met, Mrs. Walker. And I've argued with professors who considered intellectual flexibility a personal failing. 20% it is, though I still think you're being overly generous. Survival has made me many things, Mr. Hayes. Generous isn't usually one of them, but I recognize value when I see it, and I pay fair wages for fair work. That's how my father ran his ranch, and it's how I'll run mine. Catherine settled against her saddle, using it as a pillow despite the discomfort. We should sleep. Dawn comes early, and we've got a hard ride ahead. They dozed in shifts, one always alert for any sound of pursuit or danger. Catherine took the first watch, sitting with her rifle across her knees while Benjamin fell into restless sleep nearby. The Montana night pressed close around them, filled with the small sounds of nocturnal creatures and the whisper of wind through pine branches. Above, stars burned with fierce, cold brilliance, indifferent to human struggles in the darkness below. Catherine found herself thinking about the past 6 days, about how quickly everything had changed since Benjamin Hayes stepped off that train looking like he might collapse at any moment. She'd expected him to fail, had been prepared to send him back to Boston with her disappointment and his dignity somewhat intact. Instead, he'd bled for her fences, matched wits with Carson Blackwood, discovered a fortune in coal deposits, and was now proposing they cross hostile territory to file a claim that represented their only chance at salvation. Not bad for a frail scholar with patched elbows and tired eyes. When it was Benjamin's turn to keep watch, Catherine tried to sleep but found her mind racing too fast, churning through all the terrible things that might be happening at her ranch while she ran toward Helena like a coward. She imagined Murdoch's men ransacking the house, burning the barn, hurting Pete and Charlie for information about where she'd gone. She imagined returning to find nothing but ashes and graves, success too late to save the people who'd depended on her protection. "Stop," Benjamin said quietly from his position near the horses. "I can hear you thinking from here, Mrs. Walker. Torturing yourself with possibilities won't change what's happening. It'll only make you less effective when we need you most." Easy advice to give, harder to follow. Catherine sat up, abandoning the pretense of sleep. "How do you do it, Mr. Hayes? How do you stay so calm when everything's falling apart?" Benjamin was quiet for a moment, considering. "I don't feel calm. I feel terrified most of the time, of failing you, of proving I'm as useless as I look, of getting us both killed because my judgment was wrong about the coal or the route or the strategy. But I learned something working in mining camps and survey crews. Fear is just information. It tells you what matters, what you're willing to fight for, what price you're prepared to pay. The trick is listening to the fear without letting it paralyze you. That's a surprisingly philosophical perspective for a geologist. Rocks teach patience, Mrs. Walker. They take millions of years to form, reveal their secrets slowly to those willing to study them carefully. I suppose some of that geological patience rubs off on the people who spend their lives reading stone. Benjamin's silhouette shifted against the starlight. Your father understood that, I think. He saw something valuable in that ridge and had the patience not to rush into exploiting it. He waited for the right time, built the ranch as legitimate cover, established legal ownership beyond question. That takes tremendous discipline and foresight. Catherine felt her throat tighten. He died before he could capitalize on any of it. Died defending land that he knew was valuable but never got to profit from. What kind of victory is that? The kind that gives you the foundation to finish what he started. He did the hard work, Mrs. Walker, secured the land, established your claim, passed on his suspicions about the ridge's value. Now you're doing what he couldn't live long enough to do yourself. That's not failure, that's legacy. They fell silent after that, each lost in private thoughts while the night deepened around them. Catherine found herself grateful for Benjamin's presence, in a way that surprised her. She'd spent 3 years alone or nearly alone, making every decision independently, trusting no one's judgment but her own. Having a partner, even one as unlikely as this Boston scholar, felt strange and somehow comforting at the same time. Dawn came cold and gray, burning the eastern sky to copper while frost glittered on every exposed surface. They were moving within minutes, eating dried beef in the saddle while the horses picked their way down the western slope toward more level ground. By mid-morning, they'd reached the Helena Road, a rutted track that barely deserved the name but represented the main route between Copper Falls and the territorial capital. "How far now?" Benjamin asked, his voice hoarse from cold and exhaustion. 25 miles, maybe 30. If we push hard, we can make it by late afternoon. Catherine scanned the road in both directions, looking for any sign of Blackwood's men. The landscape here was more open, offering fewer places to hide, but also making ambush more difficult. Stay alert. This is where they'd try to intercept us if they figured out our route. They rode fast, but not recklessly, balancing speed against the need to keep the horses from breaking down completely. Ruby proved her worth once again, maintaining a ground-eating lope that covered miles efficiently. Duke struggled more, his age showing in the increasing frequency with which Benjamin had to dismount and lead him to give the old gelding's legs a rest. "Leave me," Benjamin said during one of these walking stretches, his breathing labored. "You can make better time without Duke slowing you down. I'll catch up when I can." "We stay together." Catherine's voice left no room for argument. "Partners don't abandon each other just because the pace gets difficult. Besides, you're carrying the survey journal. Without your geological findings, the claim is just my word against Blackwood's experts. We need that documentation." Around noon, they spotted riders ahead on the road, 3 men moving toward them at a steady trot. Catherine's hand dropped to her rifle, but as they closed the distance, she recognized the lead rider as Tom Brennan, a freight hauler she'd dealt with before. Honest, reliable, and crucially, not in Blackwood's employ. "Mrs. Walker," Tom called out, raising his hand in greeting. "You're a long way from home. Everything all right?" "Business in Helena," Catherine replied, not stopping. "We're in a hurry, Tom. No offense meant." But Tom turned his horse to ride alongside, his weathered face creasing with concern. "Might want to hear this before you get there, then. Word came through this morning. Carson Blackwood's in Helena himself. Arrived last night with 6 men and a lawyer from back east. Word is he's filing some kind of legal claim against your property, something about disputed boundaries and prior mineral rights." Catherine felt her stomach drop like a stone into deep water. "He's trying to file first. He's going to claim the coal deposit is on his land, not mine." "Then he's already at the territorial office?" Benjamin's voice was tight with controlled panic. "We're too late?" "Not necessarily." Tom scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Office doesn't open until 1 o'clock. They're doing some kind of records inventory this week, limited hours. You've still got time if you hurry. But Mrs. Walker, Blackwood's got men watching the building. You try to walk in there, they'll know immediately." Catherine's mind raced through options, each one more desperate than the last. "Is there a back entrance? Some way to reach the territorial office without being seen from the street?" "Not that I know of, but I'll tell you what. My freight wagon's heading into Helena right now with a load of supplies for the mercantile. You 2 could ride in the back, covered with canvas. I drop you at the side entrance of the mercantile, which shares a wall with the territorial office. There's a connecting door in the back that the clerks use. You go through the mercantile, straight through that door, and you're in the office without Blackwood's men ever seeing you approach." It was risky, dependent on too many variables Catherine couldn't control. But it was also their only real chance. "Tom, why are you helping us? Blackwood's got half the territory intimidated or bought off. What makes you willing to cross him?" Tom's expression hardened. "Because I remember when your father gave me my first freight contract, when no one else would risk money on an ex-drunk trying to rebuild his life. Because I've watched Blackwood crush every small operator who won't sell out to him. And because someone needs to stand up to that son of a bitch before he owns everything from here to the Canadian border." He gestured toward his wagon. "Now get in the back before someone sees you standing here talking." They transferred quickly, stowing their horses with a livery stable at the edge of town and promising the owner double payment to keep them safe and ready. Then they climbed into Tom's wagon, burrowing under canvas tarps that smelled of dust and old leather while he loaded crates around them for cover. The ride into Helena was suffocating and interminable, every bump and sway of the wagon threatening to jostle them into visibility. Catherine lay pressed against Benjamin in the cramped space, both of them breathing shallowly, hearts hammering in rhythm. She could hear Tom talking to someone, a deputy checking wagons, asking routine questions, and for a terrible moment she thought they'd been discovered. But Tom's voice remained easy and casual, making some joke about freight schedules and stubborn mules, and then they were moving again, the wagon rolling deeper into Helena's commercial district. Catherine could hear street noise now, voices, horses, the clatter of commerce that marked Montana Territory's capital city. The wagon stopped. Tom's voice came quiet and urgent. "Now, through the mercantile, straight back. Office opens in 10 minutes. Go. They emerged blinking into the dim interior of what appeared to be a general store, startling a clerk who was stacking canned goods on shelves. Benjamin moved first, striding toward the back with Catherine close behind, the survey journal clutched tight against his chest like a shield. The connecting door was exactly where Tom had said, half hidden behind a stack of flour sacks. They pushed through into a narrow hallway that smelled of ink and paper dust, emerging into the territorial office's main room just as a clerk was unlocking the front entrance. "Help you folks?" The clerk was young, bored-looking, probably wishing he was anywhere but stuck doing inventory on a cold autumn afternoon. "Mineral claim filing," Catherine said, her voice steadier than she felt. "New deposit discovery, full geological survey, payment in cash." The clerk perked up slightly. Claim filings were more interesting than inventory. "All right, I'll need the property description, survey documentation, and the filing fee. $20. Catherine pulled out her emergency fund while Benjamin opened his journal, laying out the careful sketches and detailed notes that documented the coal deposit's location, extent, and estimated value. The clerk examined everything with increasing interest, occasionally making marks on an official form. Outside, through the office's front windows, Catherine could see men lounging against the building across the street. Blackwood's watchers positioned exactly where Tom had warned they'd be. As she watched, one of them straightened suddenly, pointing down the street. Carson Blackwood himself was striding toward the territorial office, his expensive lawyer in tow, his expression thunderous. "How much longer?" Catherine asked, trying to keep the urgency from her voice. The clerk glanced up, unconcerned. "Just need your signature here and here. Then I'll register it in the official ledger and you'll get your certified copy." Catherine signed with shaking hands, her name looking strange and formal in the official spaces. The clerk turned to a massive leather-bound ledger, opening it to the current page and beginning to write with elaborate care, forming each letter with bureaucratic precision that made Catherine want to scream at him to hurry. The office door slammed open. Carson Blackwood stood framed in the entrance, his face twisted with rage. "Stop! I'm filing a counterclaim on that property. Those mineral rights are disputed." The clerk looked up, annoyed at the interruption. "Sir, I'm in the middle of processing Mrs. Walker's filing. If you have a counterclaim, you'll need to wait your turn and provide proper documentation." "I have documentation right here." Blackwood shoved a sheaf of papers at the clerk. "Survey report dated 3 months ago showing that coal deposit is on Double B property, not the Walking W. Her boundaries are incorrect, and she's attempting to file fraudulent claims." The clerk examined Blackwood's papers with the same methodical care he'd applied to Benjamin's journal. Catherine felt her pulse hammering in her temples, felt Benjamin tense beside her, both of them watching the clerk's face for any sign of which way this would fall. "These surveys contradict each other," the clerk said finally. "One says the deposit is on Walker property, one says it's on Blackwood property. I can't determine which is accurate without a proper boundary review." "Then delay her filing until the review is complete," Blackwood pressed. "Don't let her steal property that legally belongs to the Double B." "I'm afraid I can't do that either, Mr. Blackwood." The clerk's voice remained professionally neutral. "Mrs. Walker's filing is complete and paid for. Her claim is now officially registered as of," he checked his pocket watch, "1:17 this afternoon. Your counterclaim will be filed separately and adjudicated through proper legal channels." Catherine felt something release in her chest, relief so intense it made her dizzy. "So the claim is legal? Officially recognized?" "Yes, ma'am. You now have federal protection on those mineral rights pending any successful legal challenge." The clerk handed her a certified copy of the filing, his signature and official seal making it binding under territorial law. "Congratulations on your discovery." Blackwood's face went purple with rage. "This is fraud. I'll have federal marshals investigate. I'll bring so much legal pressure down on her that you'll what, Mr. Blackwood?" Benjamin's quiet voice cut through the bluster like a knife. "Challenge a legally filed claim backed by professional geological survey and witness testimony? I'm Benjamin Hayes, formerly of Barrett Mining Company. My credentials are documented and verifiable. Mrs. Walker's claim is legitimate, properly researched, and filed according to all territorial regulations." He smiled slightly. I believe if anyone brings federal attention to this situation, they'll be very interested in why you're so desperate to suppress a widow's legal mineral rights. Almost like you knew about the deposit and were trying to steal it through intimidation and illegal claim jumping. The silence stretched tight and dangerous. Blackwood's hand twitched toward his coat, and Catherine saw one of his men through the window reaching for a weapon. But they were standing in the territorial office surrounded by witnesses, including a board clerk who was now watching the confrontation with sharp interest. Violence here would bring exactly the kind of federal attention Blackwood had been trying to avoid. "This isn't over," Blackwood said quietly, his voice dropping to something cold and deadly. "Not by a long shot, Catherine. You've made a very expensive mistake today." "No," Catherine replied, matching his tone. "I've made a very profitable discovery, and you've just lost your leverage. From this moment forward, Mr. Blackwood, we're operating on equal legal ground. If you want my land, you'll have to buy it at fair market value, and the price just went up considerably." Blackwood turned and stalked from the office, his lawyer scrambling to follow. Through the window, Catherine watched him gather his men and mount up, his gestures sharp with barely controlled fury. They rode north toward Copper Falls at a hard gallop, and Catherine's stomach knotted with fresh fear. "He's going back to the ranch," she said urgently. "He's going to take his anger out on Pete and Charlie. We have to get back there now." They retrieved their horses and left Helena at a dead run, pushing the animals harder than was safe, but having no choice. The certified claim papers were secured in Catherine's coat pocket, federal protection that meant nothing if Blackwood murdered her ranch hands and burned her buildings before anyone could enforce the law. The ride back was a blur of exhaustion and fear, miles disappearing beneath Ruby's hooves while Duke struggled gamely to keep pace. They pushed through the night, navigating by starlight and desperate hope, reaching the northern ridge as dawn broke cold and gray over the valley. Catherine crested the final rise, expecting to see smoke and destruction, expecting the worst of what Blackwood's rage might have produced. Instead, she saw her ranch still standing, buildings intact, smoke rising peacefully from the bunkhouse chimney. And standing in the yard beside Pete and Charlie were 4 men wearing federal marshal badges, their horses tied outside the barn, their presence stopping her heart with confusion and cautious hope. They rode down slowly, Catherine's hand near her rifle despite the marshal's presence. The lead federal man stepped forward as they dismounted, his weathered face serious but not hostile. "Mrs. Catherine Walker, I'm Marshal James Reeves. We received a telegram yesterday from your ranch hands reporting threats and intimidation by Carson Blackwood's hired men. We arrived last night, persuaded Mr. Blackwood's men to depart, and have been waiting for your return." His gaze moved to Benjamin. "This would be Mr. Benjamin Hayes, the geological surveyor?" "Yes," Catherine said carefully, not understanding but desperately grateful. "Marshal, who sent that telegram? Pete and Charlie couldn't have—" "I sent it," Pete said, stepping forward with a slight smile. "Before Murdoch and his boys arrived, while they were still just watching the ranch. Rode into Copper Falls, sent a telegram to the federal marshal's office in Helena, explaining the situation and requesting immediate assistance. Figured if things were escalating this fast, we'd need more than just our rifles." Catherine stared at her old friend, feeling tears prick her eyes for the first time in years. "Pete, you magnificent, sneaky old cavalry scout. You bought us the time we needed. Tried to buy you some protection, too, though that part was a near thing. Marshals arrived just before Murdoch was getting serious about making examples." Pete's expression hardened. "But they're gone now, and we're still standing. Did you get the claim filed?" Catherine pulled the certified papers from her coat and held them up like a battle standard. "Filed, registered, and federally protected. The Walking W owns the mineral rights to that coal deposit, and Carson Blackwood can't do a damn thing about it except hire lawyers and lose." Marshal Reeves examined the papers carefully. "This changes things considerably. Claim jumping is federal jurisdiction, Mrs. Walker. If Blackwood tries any more intimidation or harassment related to these mineral rights, you send word immediately. The territorial government takes mining claims very seriously. It's about the only thing bringing real money into Montana these days." They talked for another hour, Catherine and Benjamin providing detailed accounts of Blackwood's threats and tactics, while the marshals took careful notes. By the time the federal men rode out, promising to maintain periodic patrols and warning that Blackwood would face prosecution if he continued his harassment, the sun was fully up and Catherine was swaying with exhaustion. Benjamin looked even worse, his face gray with fatigue, his hands shaking as he unsaddled Duke. Pete caught him as he started to collapse, easing him down to sit against the barn wall. "Easy there, city boy. You've earned a rest." Pete's gruff voice held unexpected respect. "Heard you baited Blackwood pretty good. Got him rattled enough to make mistakes. That took more guts than I credited you for when you first stepped off that train." "Just geology and stubbornness," Benjamin muttered, his eyes already closing. "Mrs. Walker did all the hard parts." Catherine found herself smiling despite everything. The exhaustion, the fear, the knowledge that this victory was just the opening move in a much longer war. "Get him into the bunkhouse, Pete. Let him sleep for 24 hours if he needs it. He's earned that much and more." She walked into her house alone, into the quiet rooms her father had built, and finally let herself feel the weight of what they'd accomplished. The coal deposit was legally hers, documented and protected by federal authority. Blackwood's leverage was gone, his intimidation tactics now subject to federal prosecution. She had resources to pay off the bank, to rebuild the ranch, to honor her father's legacy with success instead of desperate survival. And she had a partner, unlikely, unexpected, and absolutely invaluable. Catherine pulled out her father's old Bible, the one where she'd hidden her emergency fund, and opened it to the page where he'd always marked important passages. There, in his careful handwriting, was a note she'd never seen before. "The ridge holds our future. Wait for the right moment, the right partner. Don't fight this battle alone." He'd known. Her father had known about the coal, had known she'd need help, had somehow trusted that she'd find the right person to stand with her when the time came. "Found him, Dad?" Catherine whispered to the empty room. "He's a frail scholar from Boston with patched elbows and no idea how to work cattle. But he's stubborn and honest and braver than he looks. I think you would have liked him." Outside, dawn broke fully over the Walking W ranch, painting everything in shades of gold and promise. The real fight was just beginning. Blackwood wouldn't surrender his ambitions easily, and turning a coal deposit into actual profit would require months of hard work and careful planning. But for the first time in 3 years, Catherine Walker felt something besides desperation and grief. She felt hope, grounded in federal paperwork and geological expertise, and the quiet partnership of a man who'd proven himself when it mattered most. The story was far from over, but this chapter at least had ended in victory. Catherine woke to the sound of hammering and voices, disoriented by the late afternoon light slanting through her bedroom window. She'd slept 14 hours straight, her body finally surrendering to the exhaustion accumulated over 6 impossible days. For a confused moment, she thought she was dreaming, that the coal deposit and the filing and the federal marshals had all been desperate fantasy born from too many sleepless nights. Then she saw the certified claim papers on her nightstand, official and undeniable, and reality settled back into place with all its complicated weight. She dressed quickly and stepped out onto the porch to find the ranch yard transformed. Pete and Charlie were repairing the corral fence with new lumber that must have come from town. Benjamin sat on the bunkhouse steps with a cup of coffee, his face still drawn but his eyes alert, talking with a man Catherine didn't recognize, a well-dressed stranger with surveyor's equipment scattered around him. "Mrs. Walker!" the stranger called out, standing as she approached. "I'm Robert Chen, mining engineer from Butte. Mr. Hayes sent a telegram yesterday requesting consultation on developing your coal deposit. I took the first train down when I heard about the discovery. Anthracite deposits in Montana are rare enough to warrant immediate attention." Catherine shot Benjamin a look that promised a longer conversation later. "Mr. Hayes moves fast for someone who could barely stand yesterday." "Momentum, Mrs. Walker." Benjamin's voice was still rough but steady. "We filed the claim, but that's just the beginning. We need professional assessment of the deposit's commercial viability, development cost estimates, and contact with potential buyers or investors. Mr. Chen has 20 years of experience in coal mining operations. I thought his expertise might prove valuable." Robert Chen spread a large sheet of paper across the bunkhouse steps, a detailed map with Benjamin's survey notes transferred and expanded. "Based on Mr. Hayes' preliminary findings, you're looking at a premium anthracite deposit with exceptional purity. Conservative estimate is 200,000 tons of recoverable coal. At current market prices, that's somewhere between $75,000 and $100,000 in gross revenue, depending on transportation costs and market access. The numbers were so large they felt abstract, disconnected from the reality of her struggling ranch and unpaid debts. Catherine found herself almost unable to process them. And development costs? What would it take to actually extract and sell that coal? That's the challenging part. Chen pointed to various marks on his map. You'll need a proper mine shaft, support structures, rail access for transportation, and a workforce. Initial capital investment would be around $15,000 for basic operations. More for a professional setup. That's money most independent operators don't have, which is why they typically sell to larger mining companies or take on investor partners. 15,000. Catherine felt the hope that had been building since the claim filing start to crumble. I have $30 in emergency funds and a $3,000 bank debt. Where exactly would I get $15,000 for development? From investors who recognize value when they see it. Benjamin stood, moving carefully like someone whose body was still protesting recent abuse. Mr. Chen has contacts in Butte and Denver, mining investors looking for promising deposits with clear ownership and federal protection. We present them with professional survey data, development plans, and profit projections. They provide capital in exchange for a percentage of revenue. Standard mining partnership arrangement, which means giving up a chunk of my mineral rights to strangers who will want control over operations. Catherine heard the bitterness in her own voice. I spent 3 years fighting to keep this ranch independent, and now you're suggesting I hand over control to outside investors? I'm suggesting you transform a valuable deposit you can't afford to develop into actual money that saves your ranch and secures your future. Benjamin's tone was patient but firm. Mrs. Walker, that coal is worthless unless we can extract and sell it. You can own 100% of an undeveloped claim that generates no income, or you can own 40% of a profitable mining operation that pays off your debts and provides steady revenue for decades. The mathematics are straightforward. Chen nodded agreement. I've seen dozens of small operators try to develop claims independently. Most fail within 6 months, run out of capital, hit unexpected problems, can't compete with larger operations. The smart ones partner early, bring in expertise and funding, and build sustainable businesses. Your deposit is valuable enough to attract serious investors, Mrs. Walker. That's a stronger position than you might think. Catherine walked away from them, needing space to think without their reasonable arguments pressing on her from all sides. She climbed onto the corral fence and stared out at the northern ridge, at the dark stone that held both salvation and the potential for new complications she hadn't fully considered. Her father had died defending this land from claim jumpers. She'd fought for 3 years to keep it independent against Blackwood's pressure, and now Benjamin was suggesting she voluntarily surrender partial control to investors she'd never met, trusting strangers with her father's legacy because the mathematics said it was the smart move. Except she knew he was right. Knew it with the same brutal clarity that had told her to file the claim in Helena instead of staying to fight Murdoch's hired guns. The coal deposit was valuable, but value meant nothing without the capital and expertise to extract it. She could cling to complete ownership and watch the opportunity slip away, or she could compromise and actually build something lasting. Pete climbed up to sit beside her on the fence rail, his weathered face thoughtful. That city fellow's making sense, you know. Been listening to him and Chen talk about development plans and profit margins. Sounds like they know what they're doing. It's not about whether they know what they're doing. It's about whether I can trust them. Catherine's voice was tired. I brought Benjamin here as a mail-order husband because I needed legal protection against Blackwood. Now he's making decisions about my mineral rights and bringing in outside consultants without asking permission first. Oh, did he actually make decisions, or did he gather information so you could make better decisions yourself? Pete's question was gentle but pointed. Seems to me Hayes has been pretty careful about respecting your authority while still using his expertise to help. That's partner behavior, Catherine. Not someone trying to take over. Catherine knew Pete was right. Knew her resistance came more from exhaustion and fear than rational assessment. But 3 years of fighting alone had taught her to be suspicious of help, to question motives, to assume everyone wanted something from her. Trusting Benjamin Hayes meant letting down walls she'd built for survival. Blackwood's not done, she said, changing the subject. Federal marshals are not. He's too invested in this to just walk away. What do you think he'll try next? Legal challenges, probably. He'll claim the boundary surveys were wrong, that the coal deposit is actually on double B land, tie you up in territorial court for months. Pete spat into the dirt. Man's got lawyers and money. He'll use both to make your life hell while hoping you run out of resources to fight back. Then we need to move faster than he can. Get the mine operational, start generating revenue, build enough financial stability that his legal challenges become expensive nuisances instead of existential threats. Catherine climbed down from the fence. Which means I need to talk seriously with Mr. Chen about investors and partnerships, doesn't it? Means you need to stop thinking of asking for help as weakness and start thinking of it as strategy. Pete's voice held a note of approval. Your father was stubborn too, but he knew when to accept assistance. That's why he hired me when I was nothing but an ex-drunk cavalry scout looking for redemption. He saw value where others saw liability. Catherine found herself smiling despite everything. And you think Benjamin Hayes is my version of that? The liability that might turn into valuable asset? I think he's already proven valuable, and you're just scared to admit how much you've started to rely on him. Pete stood, stretching his old bones with audible cracks. Now, go talk to your partner and his mining engineer friend. Figure out how to turn that coal into the future your father wanted for you. Catherine walked back to the bunkhouse steps where Benjamin and Robert Chen were engaged in detailed discussion about shaft angles and ventilation systems. They both looked up as she approached, and she saw Benjamin's expression shift to something guarded, prepared for her objection to his initiative. Mr. Chen, Catherine said, keeping her voice level and businesslike. What kind of timeline are we looking at? Assuming we can secure investor capital, how long before the mine is operational and producing revenue? Chen's face lit with professional enthusiasm. With adequate funding and clear ownership, 3 months for basic infrastructure, another 2 for initial extraction operations. You could have your first coal shipment to market by late spring, assuming winter doesn't shut down construction completely. That's aggressive, but achievable if we move quickly. And investors? How would we find them, and what kind of terms would they expect? I can make introductions within a week. Mining investors in Butte and Denver are always looking for premium deposits with solid geological data. Chen gestured to Benjamin's survey journal. Mr. Hayes' documentation is thorough and professional, exactly what serious investors need to make funding decisions. Terms would be negotiable, but typically you'd be looking at 50-50 revenue split after initial capital recovery, with you retaining operational control subject to investor oversight. 50%. Half of everything the coal generated, in exchange for the capital needed to extract it. Catherine did the mathematics quickly. 50% of $75,000 was still $37,000, more money than she'd see in a decade of ranching. Enough to pay off the bank, rebuild the herd, hire proper help, maybe even expand operations. Enough to transform survival into actual prosperity. All right, she said, the decision crystallizing with unexpected clarity. Draft your investor proposal, Mr. Chen. Make it professional and complete. Mr. Hayes, I'll need your survey data compiled into formal presentation format. We'll approach investors together, negotiate terms together, and make all final decisions together. Partnership means shared authority and shared risk. Understood. Benjamin's expression shifted to something that might have been relief or gratitude or both. Understood completely, Mrs. Walker. Thank you for trusting me this far. Don't thank me yet. We've got months of hard work ahead, and Blackwood's not going to make any of it easy. Catherine turned to head back into the house, then paused. And Mr. Hayes, next time you want to telegram a mining engineer, ask me first. Partners consult each other before making moves, remember? Noted, Benjamin replied, and Catherine caught the slight smile in his voice. I'll try to remember that consultation is part of partnership, not just geological surveying. The next week passed in a blur of activity that left little time for worry. Robert Chen stayed at the ranch, conducting his own survey of the coal deposit and drafting detailed development proposals. Benjamin worked alongside him, translating geological findings into language investors could understand. Catherine managed the regular ranch operations while also preparing financial documentation that would show potential partners she was a serious operator despite her current difficulties. Pete and Charlie took over most of the physical labor, freeing Catherine and Benjamin to focus on the mining project. It was strange seeing Benjamin hunched over paperwork instead of struggling with fence posts, but Catherine had to admit he was far more valuable doing what he actually trained for than trying to match ranch hands at manual labor. Marshal Reeves returned on the 5th day, his expression serious enough to spike Catherine's anxiety immediately. "Mrs. Walker, we need to talk. Carson Blackwood has filed formal legal challenges to your mineral claim. He's alleging boundary fraud and claiming the coal deposit falls within Double B territory." Catherine felt ice settle in her stomach despite having expected exactly this move. "On what basis? The property lines have been surveyed and documented for 20 years. He's produced an alternative survey from 1891 that shows different boundary markers. Says your father's original claim was improperly filed, and the ridge should have been part of adjacent federal land that Blackwood later purchased." Reeves pulled out a sheaf of papers. "It's going to territorial court next month. You'll need a lawyer, and you'll need to prove your boundaries are legitimate." "How much does a territorial court lawyer cost?" Catherine already knew the answer would be more than she could afford. "Good one? $500 minimum, probably more if the case drags out." Reeves looked sympathetic but realistic. "Mrs. Walker, I can't give legal advice, but I will say this. Blackwood's playing a long game. He knows you're cash poor even with the coal claim. He's trying to bleed you dry with legal fees while his challenges prevent you from developing the mine. By the time the court rules in your favor, you might be too broke to capitalize on the victory. Unless we move faster than he expects." Benjamin appeared in the doorway, his expression thoughtful. "Marshal, what's the timeline on his legal challenge? When does it actually block our mining operations?" "Court hearing is November 20th. Until then, technically your claim stands and you can proceed with development. But most investors won't put money into a disputed claim. Too much risk, the court will rule against you and they'll lose everything they invested." Benjamin and Catherine exchanged glances, and she saw him reach the same conclusion she had. "Then we develop without investors," Benjamin said quietly. "At least the initial phase. Prove the deposit's value, start generating revenue, build enough financial momentum that Blackwood's challenge becomes irrelevant." "With what capital?" Catherine's voice was flat. "We need $15,000 for proper development. I have maybe $3,000 if I sell off half my herd, and that leaves me with no ranch operation at all." "You have $3,000, and I have $2,000 in savings from my Boston years." Benjamin's tone was matter-of-fact, discussing money he'd mentioned. "$5,000 isn't enough for full development, but it's enough for a small-scale operation. We sink a basic shaft, extract enough coal to prove quality and quantity, sell the first shipment to demonstrate market viability. That proof makes the claim much stronger in court and much more attractive to investors." "You're suggesting we bet everything on a bootstrap mining operation with no safety margin and Carson Blackwood trying to destroy us through legal challenges?" Catherine heard the edge in her own voice. "That's not a plan, Mr. Hayes. That's desperation with a geological survey attached." "It's survival," Benjamin corrected gently. "The same kind you've been practicing for 3 years on this ranch. The same kind that brought you to Boston, looking for a mail-order husband because conventional solutions had failed. We use what we have, we work harder than seems possible, and we move fast enough that Blackwood can't stop us before we build momentum." Marshal Reeves cleared his throat. "For what it's worth, bold action might be your best strategy here. Blackwood's counting on you being cautious, playing defensive, letting him control the pace. If you move aggressively instead, start mining operations immediately, generate revenue proof, maybe even get that first shipment to market before the court hearing, you change the entire dynamic. Judges look more favorably on working claims than theoretical ones." Catherine walked to the window and stared out at the northern ridge, at the coal deposit that represented both salvation and terrible risk. Every instinct told her this was madness, betting her last resources and Benjamin's life savings on an undercapitalized mining operation while fighting legal battles against an enemy with vastly superior resources. It was exactly the kind of desperate gamble that destroyed people. But what was the alternative? Wait for Blackwood's legal challenges to bleed her dry? Hope some investor would risk capital on a disputed claim? Surrender the coal deposit and watch everything her father built disappear into Carson Blackwood's empire? $5,000, she said quietly. Combined savings, no safety net, everything riding on making this work. Mr. Chen, can you actually develop a producing mine for 5,000? Robert Chen had been listening silently from his position near the bunkhouse. Now he stepped forward, his expression serious. I can develop a bare-bones operation. One shaft, minimal infrastructure, hand tools and blasting powder instead of mechanical equipment. It'll be slow, dangerous, and physically brutal. But yes, for 5,000 we can extract coal and get it to market. Won't be efficient or comfortable, but it'll prove the deposit's commercial viability. How long? Benjamin asked. 6 weeks if weather holds and we get lucky. 8 weeks more realistically. Either way, we could have coal ready for market before that November court date. Chen pulled out his development sketches. I'll need to hire experienced miners, men who know how to work underground safely. That's going to eat up a chunk of your capital right there. How many men? Catherine's mind was already calculating costs against her dwindling resources. 4 minimum, 6 ideally, plus me supervising. Figure $30 per man per week, hazard pay included. For 8 weeks, that's... Chen did quick math. $1,900 in labor costs, plus materials, equipment rental, blasting supplies, and contingency fund for unexpected problems. Your 5,000 will be gone in 6 weeks, Mrs. Walker. This only works if we hit coal fast and get it to market faster. The numbers were terrifying in their stark simplicity. Catherine would be committing everything, her savings, Benjamin's life savings, probably having to sell off half her herd for additional operating capital. If anything went wrong, if the mine hit unexpected problems or the coal quality proved inconsistent or Blackwood sabotaged their operations, they'd be completely ruined. But if it worked, if they could prove the deposit and generate revenue before the court hearing, they'd have real leverage against Blackwood's legal challenges and actual proof to show potential investors. Pete, Catherine called out, and her old friend appeared from the barn where he'd been pretending not to listen to the entire conversation. What do you think? Am I about to make the worst mistake of my life, or is this actually possible? Pete studied her for a long moment, his weathered face thoughtful. I think you're about to risk everything on a hard gamble with bad odds. But I also think you've been doing that every day for 3 years just to keep this ranch running. Only difference now is you've got a partner with actual expertise and a marshal who seems inclined to help. That's better odds than you've had before. Catherine turned to Benjamin, seeing him clearly in the afternoon light. This frail scholar who'd survived a week of brutal ranch work, who'd discovered her coal deposit, who'd proposed they cross hostile mountains to file a claim, and who was now offering his entire life savings to help develop a mining operation he had no legal obligation to support. Why? She asked quietly. You've already done more than anyone could expect. The coal deposit is filed in my name. You don't legally own any of it. Why risk your savings on my problems? Benjamin's expression was difficult to read behind his spectacles. Because I told you in Boston that I came west looking for a chance to fight back against corruption and greed. Because you gave me that chance when you could have sent me back on the first train. Because, he paused, choosing words carefully, because I've never had something worth fighting for before. Just jobs, just wages, just positions that disappeared when I made difficult ethical choices. This is different. This is building something that matters with someone who matters. That's worth investing in, Mrs. Walker, worth risking everything for. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications neither was quite ready to name. Then Catherine nodded once, decision made with the same grim finality she'd felt filing the mineral claim in Helena. All right, we do this. $5,000, bare-bones operation, 6 to 8 weeks to produce marketable coal before the November court date. She looked at Robert Chen. Hire your miners, order your equipment, and get started immediately. Mr. Hayes, work with Chen on the technical side while I handle ranch operations and legal preparation. Marshal Reeves, I'll need documentation of every threat and harassment incident from Blackwood over the past 3 years. We're going to need evidence for that court hearing. And what about me? Pete asked. You and Charlie keep the ranch running while I'm distracted with mining operations. Also, you're both getting raises. Can't afford to lose you now. Catherine managed a tired smile. We're going to need all hands working overtime for the next 2 months. If we pull this off, everyone shares in the success. If we fail, at least we'll fail having tried everything possible. The next 3 days were consumed by frantic preparation. Catherine sold 60 head of cattle at poor prices to a buyer in Copper Falls, generating another $2,000 in working capital that went straight into the mining fund. Benjamin and Chen hired miners from nearby settlements, experienced men willing to work a risky operation for good wages and profit-sharing promises if the mine succeeded. Carson Blackwood's response came on the fourth day, delivered by a well-dressed lawyer who arrived in an expensive buggy with papers authorizing legal injunction against mining operations on disputed territory. Catherine read them carefully, standing on her own porch while the lawyer waited with obvious impatience. "These papers request an injunction," she said finally. "But the court hasn't granted it yet, which means legally I can continue operations until a judge rules otherwise. Mrs. Walker, I strongly advise against that course of action." The lawyer's tone was professionally smooth. "If the court rules that you've been extracting minerals from disputed territory, you could face significant penalties and damage claims. Mr. Blackwood is offering you one final opportunity to negotiate a settlement. Sell him the Walking W at a generous price and avoid costly litigation." "How generous?" Catherine kept her voice neutral, curious what Blackwood now considered adequate given the confirmed coal deposit. $10,000 for the entire ranch, including all mineral rights. Catherine laughed, a harsh sound that made the lawyer flinch. "My coal deposit alone is worth $75,000 at minimum. The ranch is worth another $5,000 to $10,000. And you're offering me $10,000 total? Tell Mr. Blackwood that if he wants to insult me, he should at least do me the courtesy of insulting me directly instead of sending lawyers to deliver offensive lowball offers." The lawyer's professional facade cracked slightly. "Mrs. Walker, you're making a serious mistake. Mr. Blackwood has resources you cannot hope to match. He will bury you in legal challenges, destroy your operations through perfectly legal channels, and wait patiently for you to exhaust yourself fighting battles you cannot win. Then he'll be waiting a long time." Catherine handed the papers back. "Tell your client I'm not selling, not negotiating, and not intimidated. The Walking W was built by my father and defended by his blood. I'll be damned if I surrender it to a claim jumper with a law degree. Now get off my property before I ask Marshal Reeves to investigate which territorial judges are on Blackwood's payroll." The lawyer left, but Catherine knew his visit was just the opening salvo in what would be an extended legal war. Blackwood was moving on multiple fronts: legal challenges, economic pressure, probably still planning sabotage operations despite the federal marshal's presence. She was fighting an enemy with vastly superior resources on terrain he largely controlled. But she had something Blackwood didn't: legitimate ownership, federal protection, geological proof of value, and a partner who'd proven himself capable of extraordinary things under impossible pressure. The mine shaft broke ground on October 28th, exactly 2 weeks after Catherine had first stood on the train platform, hoping a mail-order husband might save her failing ranch. Robert Chen supervised while his hired miners sank the initial shaft into the ridge, following the coal seam Benjamin had identified. Catherine watched from a distance, seeing her last savings disappear into a dark hole in the earth, while praying this desperate gamble would pay off before Blackwood's legal challenges destroyed everything. Benjamin worked alongside the miners despite his obvious physical limitations, doing whatever unskilled labor he could manage while Chen handled the technical operations. Catherine saw him stumble with exhaustion at the end of each day, saw the bloody blisters on his hands and the coal dust ground into his skin, and felt something fierce stir in her chest. This was not the frail scholar who'd stepped off the train 2 weeks ago. This was a partner who'd invested everything, his savings, his expertise, his physical endurance, into her impossible fight. And watching him refuse to quit despite obvious suffering, Catherine realized she'd stopped thinking of him as the mail-order husband she'd settled for and started thinking of him as something far more complicated and potentially dangerous to her careful emotional walls. On November 3rd, 7 days into mining operations, they hit the main seam, thick, black, beautiful anthracite exactly as Benjamin's survey had predicted. The miners brought up sample chunks, and Robert Chen tested them with professional equipment, his expression growing more enthusiastic with each analysis. "Premium grade," he announced that evening, holding up a chunk of coal that gleamed like polished obsidian in the lamplight. "Clean burning, high heat value, minimal impurities. Mrs. Walker, this is exactly what locomotive companies and steel manufacturers pay premium prices for. We need to get samples to potential buyers immediately. Start securing contracts before court challenges complicate sales. How much can we extract before the November 20th hearing? Catherine asked. If we work around the clock in shifts, maybe 15 tons. Not huge, but enough to demonstrate commercial viability and start generating actual revenue. Chen looked at his crew of exhausted miners. It'll push everyone to their limits, but it's achievable. Benjamin appeared in the doorway, so filthy with coal dust Catherine barely recognized him. Then we push. No safety margins, no careful pacing. We extract maximum coal in minimum time and prove to any judge or investor that this deposit is real, valuable, and actively producing revenue. The next 17 days were the hardest Catherine had ever experienced, and she'd survived 3 Montana winters running a failing ranch alone. The miners worked brutal shifts, extracting coal as fast as safety allowed. Catherine managed logistics, securing wagons for transportation, arranging rail shipment from Copper Falls, negotiating with potential buyers in Helena and Butte. Benjamin split his time between the mine and helping Catherine with business operations, somehow functioning on 4 hours of sleep and willpower alone. Blackwood's harassment continued, but grew more subtle, more legal. There were property disputes filed with the territorial office, complaints to the sheriff about unsafe mining operations, even an attempt to bribe the railroad into refusing shipment of Walking W coal. Catherine fought back on every front, using Marshal Reeves's federal authority when necessary and her own stubborn refusal to surrender when that failed. On November 18th, 2 days before the court hearing, they loaded 15 tons of anthracite coal onto wagons bound for the Copper Falls Rail Depot. Catherine rode alongside the convoy with her rifle across her lap, Benjamin beside her with his survey journal documenting every step of the process for court evidence. Pete and Charlie followed on horseback, watching for any sign of Blackwood's interference. They reached Copper Falls without incident, loaded the coal onto rail cars, and secured bills of lading that proved shipment and sale value. Catherine felt something release in her chest as the train pulled out heading toward Butte with their first commercial shipment, proof, undeniable and documented, that the Walking W coal deposit was producing revenue. "We did it," Benjamin said quietly, watching the train disappear down the track. Not full development, not massive profits yet, but working proof that the claim is legitimate and commercially viable. That's what matters in court. Catherine turned to look at him. This man who'd been a complete stranger 21 days ago and was now her partner in the most important fight of her life. Coal dust still marked his face, exhaustion lined his eyes, but there was satisfaction in his expression that made her heart catch unexpectedly. "We did it," she agreed. "Now we just have to convince a judge that Blackwood's boundary disputes are fraudulent attempts at claim jumping. Should be simple, right?" Benjamin's laugh was tired but genuine. "About as simple as everything else we've accomplished these past 3 weeks, which means absolutely impossible by any rational standard." They rode back to the ranch in companionable silence, both too exhausted for extended conversation. The November hearing loomed 2 days away, and Catherine knew Blackwood would deploy every legal weapon he possessed to challenge her claim. But for the first time since her father's death, she felt like she was fighting from a position of strength rather than desperate survival. The coal was real. The deposit was valuable. The mine was producing revenue. And she had documentation, federal protection, and a partner whose expertise and determination had proven invaluable at every impossible turn. Whatever happened in that courtroom, Catherine Walker was not going down without making Carson Blackwood regret every moment of his attempts to steal her father's legacy. The real battle was about to begin, and she was finally ready to fight it. The territorial courthouse in Helena was packed when Catherine and Benjamin arrived on the morning of November 20th. Ranchers and miners filled the gallery, drawn by news that had spread across Montana territory. A widow fighting Carson Blackwood's empire over coal deposits worth a fortune. Catherine recognized faces from Copper Falls, saw Pete and Charlie sitting near the back, and noticed Marshal Reeves standing against the side wall with his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. Carson Blackwood sat at the plaintiff's table with 3 expensive lawyers, his posture radiating confidence. He caught Catherine's eye as she entered and smiled slightly, as if this were already decided in his favor. Benjamin touched her elbow gently. "Remember, we have documentation, federal protection, and commercial proof. Blackwood has legal theories and disputed surveys. Facts beat theories when judges are paying attention. Catherine nodded, settling into her chair at the defendant's table. She'd spent $200 she couldn't afford on a territorial lawyer named Samuel Garrett, a former federal prosecutor who'd agreed to take her case after reviewing Benjamin's geological documentation. Garrett was in his 60s, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, with a reputation for destroying weak arguments through methodical cross-examination. Judge Helena Morrison entered, and the courtroom rose. Morrison was 53, one of the few female judges in Montana Territory, appointed by the federal government specifically because she had a reputation for being immune to local corruption and intimidation. Catherine had heard stories about her, how she'd ruled against powerful mining companies, how she'd once held a territorial sheriff in contempt for trying to bribe her clerk. If Catherine was going to get a fair hearing anywhere, it would be in Morrison's courtroom. "We're here regarding Blackwood versus Walker, territorial case number 8732. Morrison's voice was clear and commanding. "Mr. Blackwood is challenging Mrs. Walker's mineral claim, alleging boundary fraud and prior ownership rights. Mr. Blackwood's counsel, present your opening argument." The lead lawyer stood. A man named Preston, who'd probably cost Blackwood more than Catherine's entire ranch was worth before the coal discovery. "Your Honor, this case is straightforward. Mrs. Walker filed a mineral claim on October 17th for coal deposits she alleges exist on her property. However, our surveys clearly demonstrate that the deposit in question actually lies on land owned by Mr. Blackwood's Double B Ranch. Mrs. Walker's boundary markers are based on an 1887 survey that contained significant errors. We have documentation from an 1891 federal survey that corrects those errors and places the disputed ridge within Double B territory. Preston produced maps and survey documents, laying them out with practiced efficiency. Catherine felt her stomach knot as she saw how professional Blackwood's case looked, how carefully constructed the challenge appeared. Samuel Garrett stood slowly, his movements deliberate. "Your Honor, if I may address several critical points before we proceed further. First, Mr. Blackwood's 1891 survey was never filed with the territorial office and therefore has no legal standing. Second, Mrs. Walker's property has been continuously occupied and improved since 1877, establishing clear adverse possession rights regardless of minor survey discrepancies. Third, and most importantly, Mrs. Walker's mineral claim is not theoretical. She has already extracted and sold commercial coal from the disputed deposit, providing physical proof that the valuable resources exist on her documented property." Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly. "Mrs. Walker has extracted coal already? In the months since filing her claim?" "Yes, Your Honor. 15 tons extracted and shipped to commercial buyers in Butte. We have bills of lading, railway documentation, and geological survey reports from a certified mining engineer." Garrett gestured to Benjamin. "This is Mr. Benjamin Hayes, formerly of Barrett Mining Company in Boston. His credentials and geological expertise are documented and verifiable. He conducted the original survey that identified the deposit, and he's prepared to testify regarding both the location and commercial viability of the coal seam." Blackwood's lawyer objected immediately. "Your Honor, any mining operations conducted on disputed territory should be considered evidence of trespass, not legitimate claim development. Mrs. Walker has essentially been stealing minerals from my client's property. That would only be true if your client's ownership was established, which it is not." Morrison's tone was dry. "The mineral claim was legally filed, Mr. Preston. Until I rule otherwise, Mrs. Walker has federal protection to develop that claim. Continue, Mr. Garrett." The next 3 hours were a blur of technical testimony and legal arguments. Benjamin took the stand and walked through his geological findings with calm precision, explaining how he'd identified the coal seam, tested its quality, and estimated its commercial value. Blackwood's lawyers tried to discredit his credentials, bringing up his blacklisting from Barrett Mining, but Benjamin turned it into an advantage. "I was blacklisted because I refused to falsify geological reports to help Barrett Mining cheat farmers out of fair land values," Benjamin said clearly. "I lost my career because I chose professional integrity over corporate corruption. That's exactly the kind of expertise Mrs. Walker needed, a surveyor who would document truth rather than convenient fictions. Preston tried another angle. Mr. Hayes, isn't it true that you answered Mrs. Walker's advertisement for a mail-order husband? That you have personal financial interest in supporting her claims, regardless of their legitimacy? I answered an advertisement for work opportunities, yes. But my geological findings are based on scientific methodology, not personal bias. The coal deposit exists precisely where my survey indicated it would. Mrs. Walker has extracted and sold 15 tons of premium anthracite, proving both location and quality. Those are objective facts, Mr. Preston, not romantic sentiments. Catherine felt her face flush but kept her expression neutral. The courtroom had grown very quiet, everyone listening with obvious fascination to this exchange between the city scholar and the expensive lawyer. Morrison called a recess for lunch, and Catherine found herself pacing in the courthouse hallway while Samuel Garrett reviewed his notes. Benjamin appeared with coffee he'd acquired from somewhere, pressing a cup into her shaking hands. "We're doing well," he said quietly. "Preston's struggling because he's trying to argue theory against physical evidence. The coal exists, we extracted it, we sold it. Those facts are very difficult to dispute. Unless Morrison rules that Blackwood's boundary claims are legitimate and everything we extracted was stolen property." Catherine's voice was tight with tension. "Then we're not heroes, we're thieves. Then we present the boundary evidence and prove his surveys are fraudulent." Benjamin's calm was almost infuriating. "Mrs. Walker, we prepared for this. We have documentation, we have witnesses, and we have truth on our side. That has to count for something." When they reconvened, Garrett called Marshal Reeves to testify about Blackwood's harassment tactics, the stolen cattle, cut fences, Murdoch's hired guns surrounding the ranch. Preston objected repeatedly, arguing it was irrelevant to boundary disputes, but Morrison allowed the testimony. "I want to understand the full context," Morrison said. "Why Mr. Blackwood is so interested in this particular property and what lengths he's gone to acquire it." Reeves's testimony was damning. He described 2 years of escalating intimidation, Blackwood's increasingly desperate purchase offers, the suspicious timing of legal challenges immediately after Catherine's mineral claim was filed. "In my professional opinion, Your Honor, this isn't a legitimate boundary dispute. This is attempted claim jumping disguised as legal process." Preston stood for cross-examination, his expression cold. "Marshal Reeves, isn't it true that you were specifically requested to investigate these allegations by Mrs. Walker, that you might have personal bias in favor of the defendant?" "I was requested to investigate by Mrs. Walker's ranch hands after they observed armed men threatening their employer," Reeves corrected. "And I don't have personal bias, Mr. Preston. I have professional obligation to prevent claim jumping and protect legitimate mineral rights. Those obligations led me to conclude that Mr. Blackwood has been engaged in systematic harassment designed to force Mrs. Walker off valuable property." Morrison made notes, her expression revealing nothing. Then she called Catherine, herself, to testify, and Catherine felt her pulse spike with anxiety as she took the stand. Garrett walked her through the ranch's history, her father's original claim, the years of hard work building the property, Thomas's death, the financial struggles that had driven her to desperate measures. Catherine kept her voice steady, refusing to show weakness even as she described the lowest moments of the past 3 years. "Why did you advertise for a mail-order husband, Mrs. Walker?" Garrett asked gently. "Because Montana territory law makes it nearly impossible for a woman to hold property independently. I needed a husband's legal standing to protect my mineral claim, to secure bank loans, to be taken seriously by territorial authorities." Catherine looked directly at Judge Morrison. "I needed partnership and protection in a system designed to force women into dependence or poverty. Mr. Hayes provided both when no one else would." Preston's cross-examination was harsh, trying to paint her as desperate and possibly fraudulent, questioning whether the coal deposit had existed before Benjamin arrived or if they'd somehow staged the discovery to support fraudulent claims. Catherine met every question with calm precision, refusing to be rattled. "Mr. Preston, my father suspected coal on that ridge 20 years ago. He never developed it because he was building a ranch and didn't have capital for mining operations. When Mr. Hayes arrived with geological expertise, he simply confirmed what my father had always believed. There's no fraud here, just patient development of a valuable resource that Mr. Blackwood wants to steal." The final testimony came from Robert Chen, who provided technical analysis of the coal deposit's location relative to documented property boundaries. Using maps, surveying equipment, and careful measurements, he demonstrated that the coal seam clearly fell within Walker property according to every legitimate survey on file with the Territorial Office. Mr. Blackwood's 1891 survey contradicts 3 previous surveys, all of which agree on boundary placement, Chen explained. In geological terms, the probability that 4 different surveys got it wrong and only Mr. Blackwood's unfiled survey got it right is essentially 0. The boundaries are clear, Your Honor. The coal is on Walker property. Preston tried to challenge Chen's credentials and methodology, but the mining engineer was unshakable. He'd spent 30 years surveying mineral deposits across the West, had worked for federal geological surveys, and knew his expertise was beyond reasonable dispute. By late afternoon, both sides had rested their cases. Judge Morrison reviewed her notes in silence while the courtroom waited with tense anticipation. Catherine found Benjamin's hand under the table, squeezing it tightly while her heart hammered against her ribs. Everything, the ranch, the coal, her entire future, hung on whatever words Morrison spoke next. I've heard extensive testimony regarding property boundaries, mineral rights, and allegations of harassment, Morrison said finally. Here are my findings. First, Mrs. Walker's property boundaries are established by multiple surveys filed with the Territorial Office and supported by 23 years of continuous occupation and improvement. Mr. Blackwood's alternative survey was never officially filed and contradicts all existing documentation. I give it no legal weight. Catherine felt the first flutter of hope, but Morrison continued without pause. Second, Mrs. Walker's mineral claim was properly filed with complete geological documentation and appropriate fees. The claim has federal protection under territorial mining law. Third, Mrs. Walker has demonstrated commercial viability by extracting and selling coal from the disputed deposit. This is not theoretical. This is active, producing mining operations. Morrison's gaze moved to Blackwood, and her expression hardened. Fourth, I find credible Marshall Reeves's testimony regarding systematic harassment designed to force Mrs. Walker from valuable property. Mr. Blackwood, you have engaged in behavior that comes dangerously close to criminal claim jumping. I'm ruling in Mrs. Walker's favor on all counts. Her mineral claim is legitimate, her property boundaries are confirmed, and you are hereby ordered to cease all harassment or face federal prosecution for interference with legitimate mining operations. The courtroom erupted in noise, cheers from some quarters, angry muttering from others. Catherine felt tears prick her eyes for the first time in years, felt relief crash over her so powerfully it left her dizzy. Benjamin's hand tightened around hers, and when she turned to look at him, she saw the same exhausted triumph reflected in his expression. Morrison banged her gavel for silence. Furthermore, I'm ordering Mr. Blackwood to pay Mrs. Walker's legal costs, $200, as penalty for filing frivolous challenges designed to harass a legitimate claim holder. This ruling is final unless appealed to federal territorial court within 30 days. We're adjourned. Catherine stood on shaking legs, accepting congratulations from Samuel Garrett and trying to process that they'd actually won. Marshall Reeves approached with a rare smile, and Pete and Charlie pushed through the crowd to offer rough handshakes and gruff words of approval. Carson Blackwood remained seated at his table, his face carefully neutral, but his eyes burning with barely controlled rage. As Catherine walked past, he spoke quietly enough that only she and Benjamin could hear. This isn't over, Catherine. You've won one battle in a war that will destroy you eventually. I have resources you can't imagine, patience you can't match, and connections that reach all the way to Mr. Blackwood. Benjamin's voice was soft, but carried surprising steel. You just lost in federal court to a widow with $3,000 and a geology degree. Your resources didn't help you, your connections didn't save you, and your threats are now on record as potential criminal harassment. I suggest you accept defeat gracefully and move on to your next attempted land grab, because this one is over. Blackwood's mask of control cracked completely. You smug little... We're done here, Catherine cut him off, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. You wanted my land because you knew about the coal. You tried intimidation, theft, legal manipulation, and everything failed. Now you'll watch while I develop that mine, pay off my debts, and build something my father would be proud of, and there's absolutely nothing you can do to stop me." They walked out of the courthouse into cold November sunshine, and Catherine felt like she was breathing freely for the first time in 3 years. The coal deposit was officially hers, federally protected and legally unassailable. Blackwood was defeated, his harassment ending under threat of federal prosecution. And she had actual revenue from their first coal shipment, proof of concept that would attract the serious investors they needed for full development. "We did it," she said wonderingly, standing on the courthouse steps while Helena bustled around them. "We actually did it." "You did it," Benjamin corrected gently. "I just confirmed what your father already suspected and helped you fight smart instead of desperate. This victory belongs to you, Mrs. Walker. Everything that comes after, that's yours too." Catherine turned to face him fully, this unlikely partner who'd transformed her impossible situation into actual victory. "Stop calling me Mrs. Walker. My name is Catherine. I think after everything we've been through, you've earned the right to use it." Something shifted in Benjamin's expression, something warm and complicated that made Catherine's heart skip unexpectedly. "Catherine," he said quietly, testing the name. "That suits you better than formality. Though I suppose I should point out that technically, you're still advertising for a mail-order husband, and I'm still the candidate who showed up. We never actually formalized any arrangements, because we've been too busy fighting for survival to worry about marriage certificates." Catherine heard the words leave her mouth and felt shock at her own boldness. "But if you're asking whether I still need a husband for legal protection, the answer is no. The ranch is secure, the mineral rights are protected, and I can operate independently now. You're free to return to Boston if you want. I'll pay you your 20% of coal revenue, and we can part as partners who accomplish something extraordinary together." Benjamin was very quiet, his eyes searching her face. "And if I don't want to return to Boston? If I'd rather stay and help develop the mine, build the operation, see this through to actual prosperity instead of just survival?" "Then you stay as my partner. Equal voice in decisions, equal share in success." Catherine paused, her heart hammering. "Or you stay as something more than partner, if you're willing. As someone who earned his place not through legal arrangement, but through courage and competence and stubborn refusal to quit when any rational person would have surrendered." The courthouse steps had gone very quiet around them, or maybe Catherine just couldn't hear anything past the rushing in her ears. Benjamin removed his spectacles, cleaned them carefully with his handkerchief, and replaced them with deliberate slowness. "Catherine," he said finally, "when I answered your advertisement, I thought I was looking for work and a fresh start. What I found was someone worth fighting for and something worth building together. I'm not interested in returning to Boston. I'm not interested in collecting my percentage and walking away. I'm interested in staying right here, developing this mine, supporting your ranch, and seeing what else we can accomplish when we stop fighting alone and start building together." "As partners?" Catherine's voice came out softer than intended. "As partners," Benjamin agreed, "and maybe, eventually, as something more when we're not running for our lives or fighting legal battles. I'm not much for romance, Catherine. I'm better with rock formations than emotional declarations, but I know value when I see it, both in coal deposits and in people. You're worth staying for, worth investing everything in, worth building a future with, if you'll have me." Catherine felt tears threatening again and angrily blinked them back. She'd survived 3 years without crying, had endured her father's death and her husband's death, and countless smaller tragedies without breaking. But standing on these courthouse steps with victory finally secured and this impossible man offering partnership that felt like something deeper, her careful control wavered dangerously. "I'll have you," she said simply. "Though I should warn you, developing a coal mine and running a ranch simultaneously is going to make the past 3 weeks look easy. You sure you're ready for that kind of permanent hardship?" Benjamin's smile was tired, but genuine. "I survived your fence posts and your barbed wire and your absolutely terrible coffee at 4 in the morning. I think I can handle mining operations and ranch management. Besides, someone needs to make sure you don't work yourself to death proving you can do everything alone." They started walking back toward where they'd left their horses, and Catherine found herself thinking about the past month, how Benjamin had arrived looking like he might collapse from exhaustion, how he'd bled for her fences and discovered her coal and crossed hostile mountains and bet his entire savings on her impossible gamble, how he'd proven himself not through the strength she'd originally wanted, but through intelligence and determination an absolute refusal to abandon partnership even when things looked hopeless. "We should probably make it legal," she said abruptly. "The marriage, I mean. Not because I need legal protection anymore, but because Montana Territory is going to be suspicious of unmarried partners running mining operations together. Easier to just file the paperwork and avoid scandal. Romance the way it should be, motivated by administrative convenience and territorial gossip avoidance." Benjamin's tone was dry but affectionate. "Very well. When we return to Copper Falls, we'll visit the territorial office and make it official. Though I should warn you, I don't have money for a ring after investing my savings in our mine." "Don't need a ring, just need a partner who won't quit when things get hard." Catherine mounted Ruby, settling into the saddle with familiar ease. "Welcome to permanent Montana residence, Mr. Hayes. Try not to freeze to death your first winter." "I'll do my best. Though given what we've already survived, hypothermia seems almost refreshingly straightforward." They rode back toward Copper Falls with Pete and Charlie, and Catherine felt something she'd almost forgotten. Contentment mixed with excitement, the sense that she wasn't just surviving anymore, but actually building toward something better. The coal deposit would take years to fully develop, would require constant work and careful management, and probably a dozen new crises she couldn't predict. But she'd face them with a partner who'd already proven his worth 100 times over. As they traveled, Benjamin rode beside her in companionable silence, occasionally pointing out geological features or making quiet observations about the landscape. Catherine found herself watching him, this frail scholar who'd turned out to be tougher than he looked, smarter than she'd expected, and stubbornly loyal in ways she'd never experienced from anyone except her father. "What are you thinking about?" Benjamin asked, catching her staring. "That you weren't the husband I expected when I sent that telegram to Boston. You were supposed to be strong enough to intimidate Blackwood, tough enough to handle ranch work without breaking, conventional enough to provide legal protection without complicating my life." Catherine's smile was rueful. "Instead, you showed up looking half dead, barely able to split firewood, and completely wrong for everything I thought I needed. Should I apologize for disappointing your expectations?" "You should accept my gratitude for being exactly what I actually needed instead of what I thought I wanted. Turns out intelligence and determination matter more than physical strength. Who knew?" Benjamin's laugh was quiet but genuine. "I'll try to remember that next time I'm struggling to keep up with actual ranch hands. Though I should point out that I've developed some decent calluses over the past month. I'm practically a frontiersman now." "You're practically a coal mining geologist who occasionally helps with ranch work when your expertise isn't needed elsewhere," Catherine corrected. "Which is perfect, because that's exactly what this operation requires. Let Pete and Charlie handle the cattle. You focus on making us rich from coal revenue." They reached Copper Falls at sunset, the town's rough buildings painted gold and crimson by the dying light. News of their court victory had traveled fast. People called congratulations from storefronts, and the newspaper editor actually stepped into the street to request an interview about the case. Catherine politely declined, too exhausted for public celebration. She just wanted to return to her ranch, to sleep in her own bed, to begin processing everything that had changed in 28 impossible days. But first they stopped at the territorial office, where a bored clerk married them with all the romance of filing property taxes. Catherine signed her name beside Benjamin's, making their partnership legal in the eyes of Montana Territory, and felt a strange sense of rightness despite the administrative dreariness of the ceremony. "Congratulations," the clerk said without enthusiasm. "That'll be $2 for the marriage certificate." They paid, collected their documentation, and emerged as legally married partners. Pete and Charlie had witnessed, and now they offered handshakes and gruff congratulations before heading toward the saloon to celebrate with whiskey. Catherine couldn't begrudge them. "Well, Mrs. Hayes," Benjamin said as they mounted their horses for the final ride back to the ranch, "how does it feel to be legally shackled to a frail Boston scholar with patched elbows?" "About the same as it felt yesterday when we were just partners. Except now I don't have to explain why you're sleeping in my bunkhouse." Catherine smiled despite her exhaustion. "How does it feel to be married to a stubborn widow who works too hard and makes terrible coffee?" "Like I made the best decision of my life when I answered that advertisement." Benjamin's voice was quiet but sincere. "Though I should warn you, I'm probably going to make terrible husband material. I get obsessive about geological formations. I'm not good at emotional conversations, and I'll probably spend too much time working the mine instead of helping with ranch operations. Then you'll fit perfectly with a wife who gets obsessive about cattle breeding, isn't good at asking for help, and will probably spend too much time working the ranch instead of managing mine operations. We'll be a disaster together, Mr. Hayes. The best kind of disaster, the productive kind. They reached the walking W as stars emerged in the darkening sky. The ranch looked different somehow, not physically changed, but transformed by everything that had happened since Catherine had stood on that train platform hoping for salvation. Her father's building still stood, the coal deposit still waited to be developed, and all the hard work of turning potential into prosperity still lay ahead. But now she wasn't facing it alone. Now she had a partner, legally, professionally, and in ways they hadn't fully explored yet, but that felt promising despite their mutual awkwardness with emotional territory. Over the following weeks, life settled into new rhythms. Robert Chen continued supervising mine operations, and the crew they'd hired stayed on for steady wages plus profit sharing. Coal extraction proceeded methodically, building inventory for spring shipments when the trains could run regularly despite mountain weather. Catherine managed ranch operations, rebuilding her herd with money from coal sales and finally paying off the bank debt that had haunted her for 3 years. Benjamin split his time between the mine and helping Catherine with business planning. Investor interest arrived as predicted, mining companies and independent operators writing to inquire about partnership opportunities now that the Walking W deposit was proven and legally secure. They negotiated carefully, ultimately accepting a development partnership that provided capital for expanded operations while leaving Catherine majority control. By Christmas, the mine was producing regularly, and the ranch was stable. Catherine found herself almost uncomfortable with prosperity after 3 years of desperate survival. She paid Pete and Charlie generous bonuses, hired 2 additional ranch hands, and finally replaced her worn-out boots with a pair that didn't leak when it rained. On Christmas Eve, she and Benjamin stood together on the ridge, overlooking the mine entrance and the ranch valley beyond. Snow fell gently, transforming the harsh landscape into something almost magical. The mine shaft entrance was marked with lanterns, work continuing even on holiday because coal production waited for no one. "Your father would be proud," Benjamin said quietly. "You saved his legacy and built something even more valuable than he imagined." "We saved it," Catherine corrected. "I couldn't have done this alone, no matter how stubborn I was about trying. Your geological survey made everything possible. Your courage made the difference between victory and defeat. Partnership makes everything possible. That's what I learned out here, that fighting alone is noble, but fighting together is effective." Benjamin was quiet for a moment, then added, "Catherine, I know we got married for administrative convenience and territorial gossip avoidance, but I want you to know, this past month, working beside you, building this operation together, it's become more than convenient partnership for me. Considerably more." Catherine felt her heart skip, felt that flutter of something she'd carefully avoided examining too closely. "Benjamin Hayes, are you trying to tell me you've developed romantic feelings? That seems very unlike the analytical geologist who prefers rock formations to emotional declarations. Even geologists can recognize value beyond mineral deposits, though I admit I'm terrible at expressing it properly." Benjamin turned to face her fully. "What I'm trying to say badly is that I'd like this to be a real marriage eventually. Not just paperwork, not just business partnership, but actual partnership in all the ways that matter. If you're willing. If I haven't completely misread what's been growing between us." Catherine studied his face in the lantern light. This man who'd arrived as a desperate gamble and become something far more important. "You haven't misread anything. But I should warn you, I'm probably even worse at romance than you are. I don't know how to be soft or conventional or whatever wives are supposed to be. I'm just going to keep working too hard and making terrible coffee and arguing about mine development strategies." "That sounds perfect. I'll keep being obsessive about geological surveys and awkward about emotional conversations and probably neglecting ranch work because I'm too focused on coal extraction. We'll be a disaster together. The best kind of disaster, the kind that builds fortunes and survives impossible odds and creates something neither of us could manage alone." Catherine found herself smiling, genuine and unguarded. "All right, Mr. Hayes, Let's make this partnership official in all the ways that matter. But I'm still not learning to make better coffee. I wouldn't dream of asking. Your terrible coffee has become strangely comforting. Reminds me I survived my first month in Montana Territory and came out stronger. They stood together watching snow fall over their shared empire, 10,000 acres of ranch land, premium coal deposits, and a future that stretched out with possibilities neither had imagined when Catherine had desperately telegraphed Boston hoping for salvation. The mine entrance glowed with lantern light. The ranch building stood solid against the winter cold, and somewhere in the valley below, Pete and Charlie were probably drinking to their employer's success and marveling that the frail city fellow had actually survived. Catherine leaned against Benjamin's shoulder, allowing herself the unfamiliar comfort of physical closeness. You weren't what I expected when I sent for a mail-order husband. You were supposed to be big and strong and intimidating, someone who'd scare off Blackwood just by existing. And you got a scrawny geologist with bad lungs and patched elbows instead. I imagine that was quite disappointing. Disappointing initially, surprising quickly, invaluable ultimately. Catherine's voice softened. You became the partner I prayed for, Benjamin, the one who saw solutions I couldn't see, who fought battles I didn't know how to fight, who refused to quit even when quitting would have been completely reasonable. That's worth more than physical intimidation ever could be. Well, I prayed for redemption after Boston destroyed my career and my confidence. I prayed for a chance to prove integrity could win against corruption, that standing up for truth wouldn't always end in ruin. You gave me that chance, Catherine. This ranch, this mine, this partnership, this is redemption. They stayed on the ridge until cold drove them down to the house where Catherine had coffee brewing and venison stew simmering on the stove. The small ranch house that had felt so empty after her father died now felt warm and alive with partnership and possibility. They ate dinner discussing mine expansion plans and spring cattle breeding strategy, their conversation flowing easily between professional topics and increasingly personal observations. Later, as stars blazed in the Montana sky and wind sang through the valley, Catherine found herself thinking about the journey that had brought them here. Her desperate telegram to Boston, Benjamin's leap of faith answering it, the 28 impossible days that had transformed everything. She'd been looking for survival and found prosperity. She'd been seeking legal protection and discovered partnership. She'd been hoping for competent help and gotten something far more valuable, someone who saw her not as a problem to solve, but as a person worth standing beside. What are you thinking about? Benjamin asked, settling beside her with his own coffee cup. That I'm glad you were too poor and desperate to intimidate Carson Blackwood. If you'd shown up as the strong ranch hand I originally wanted, we probably would have lost everything fighting conventionally. Your weakness forced us to fight smart instead of hard, and that made all the difference. So my fragility was secretly an advantage? I'll have to remember that justification next time I'm struggling with basic ranch work. Your intelligence was the advantage. Your geological expertise, your legal knowledge, your ability to see solutions I couldn't imagine, those were never weakness, Benjamin. Those were always strength, just not the obvious kind I knew how to recognize immediately. Benjamin set down his cup and took her hand, the gesture still somewhat awkward but genuine. Then I'm glad I was too poor to be impressive and too desperate to be proud. Glad I answered your advertisement despite knowing I was completely wrong for what you needed. Because what you needed and what you actually required turned out to be very different things. What I required was someone who wouldn't quit, someone who'd stand beside me against impossible odds and find ways to win battles that looked unwinnable, someone who'd invest everything, savings, expertise, physical endurance, into partnership without demanding control or recognition. Catherine squeezed his hand gently. You were exactly that, Benjamin. From the first morning you were splitting wood badly before anyone else woke up, you were exactly that. The months that followed brought steady prosperity and unexpected contentment. The mine produced coal reliably, generating revenue that transformed Catherine's financial situation from desperate to comfortable. Investors expressed interest in expanding operations, and Catherine found herself negotiating contracts and mineral rights with newfound confidence born from surviving impossible challenges. The ranch flourished too, cattle multiplying and land improving as Catherine finally had resources to invest in proper infrastructure. She hired additional help, built new outbuildings, and even started experimenting with new breeding stock that might thrive in Montana's harsh climate. Benjamin continued his geological work, surveying adjacent properties and identifying additional mineral deposits that might prove valuable. His reputation spread, the blacklisted surveyor who'd discovered premium anthracite in Montana territory, who'd stood up to corporate corruption and won. Mining companies contacted him for consulting work, and Catherine encouraged him to accept projects that didn't interfere with their operations. By spring, the Walking W Ranch had transformed completely. Where once Catherine had struggled to feed herself and two loyal ranch hands, now she employed a dozen people and operated both successful cattle and mining operations. The bank debt was paid, the mortgage was clear, and she had money in reserve for the first time in her adult life. More importantly, her partnership with Benjamin had deepened into something neither of them was particularly skilled at expressing, but both clearly valued. They worked side by side daily, their professional respect evolving into personal affection that showed itself in small gestures rather than grand declarations. Benjamin learned to make better coffee, though it was still terrible. Catherine learned to ask for help instead of stubbornly insisting she could manage everything alone. On their 6-month wedding anniversary, Benjamin surprised her with a ring he'd had crafted in Copper Falls, simple silver with a small piece of polished anthracite set in the band. "I know we got married for administrative convenience," he said, presenting it awkwardly over breakfast. "But I wanted you to have something that represented what we actually built together. Coal and silver, practical materials transformed into something valuable through effort and partnership." Catherine accepted the ring with tears she didn't bother hiding, sliding it onto her finger where it caught the morning light. "It's perfect. Completely impractical as jewelry, probably uncomfortable to work in, and absolutely perfect for us. I considered diamonds, but that seemed wrong for people who built their fortune on coal deposits and stubborn determination." Benjamin's smile was self-deprecating. "Though I admit I don't know much about romantic gestures, I'm working mostly from geological metaphors and hope." "Geological metaphors are perfect. We're sedimentary people, Benjamin, formed gradually under pressure, building layer upon layer until we became something solid enough to withstand erosion." Catherine stood and kissed him, still somewhat awkward at physical affection, but genuinely trying. "Thank you for this. Thank you for everything. Thank you for being exactly what I needed when I didn't know what I needed." By late summer, investors were offering substantial sums for partial ownership of the Walking W coal operations. Catherine and Benjamin reviewed proposals carefully, ultimately accepting a deal that provided capital for major expansion while maintaining Catherine's controlling interest. The mine grew from a small operation to a significant commercial venture, employing 30 men and producing coal that shipped throughout Montana territory and beyond. Carson Blackwood never directly challenged them again, though they heard he'd moved his operations north toward the Canadian border where competition was less fierce. Occasionally, Catherine saw him in Copper Falls, and they'd nod acknowledgement without speaking, two people who'd fought a war and knew who'd won. Marshall Reeves became a friend, stopping by the ranch periodically to check on operations and enjoy Catherine's improved cooking. Pete and Charlie grew rich by ranch hand standards, each now owning small spreads purchased with their profit-sharing bonuses. They still worked as Walking W regularly, loyal to the woman who'd trusted them through impossible times. The ranch itself became something Catherine's father would have been proud to see: prosperous, well-managed, and secured for generations through smart development and careful partnership. The main house expanded, new buildings rose for mine operations, and the Walking W became known throughout Montana territory as an example of what could be accomplished through determination and intelligence rather than just raw strength. But the real victory, Catherine thought sometimes when watching Benjamin work geological surveys or discuss mining strategies with their crew, wasn't the money or the success or even the revenge against Blackwood's attempted theft. The real victory was finding partnership when she'd been looking only for survival, discovering that the frail scholar who'd seemed completely wrong for frontier life was actually exactly right for building something lasting. On cold Montana evenings, they'd sit together on the porch overlooking their shared empire, and Catherine would remember standing on that train platform hoping a stranger might save her failing ranch. She'd expected a strong-backed laborer who could intimidate her enemies and work cattle efficiently. Instead, she'd gotten a blacklisted geologist with patched elbows who'd taught her that intelligence mattered more than strength, that partnership beat individual stubbornness, and that sometimes the things we desperately need arrive looking nothing like we expected. "What are you thinking about?" Benjamin would ask, and Catherine would smile and answer, "That you weren't the husband I expected, but you became the partner I prayed for." And Benjamin would nod and return to his geological journals, and they'd sit in comfortable silence while stars emerged over the ridge that had changed everything. The coal deposit still produced steadily, the ranch still required daily work, and Montana winters were still brutally harsh. But they faced everything together now, equal partners in prosperity built from impossible odds and stubborn refusal to surrender. The mail-order husband who'd arrived looking like failure had become the foundation of success Catherine never imagined possible. And in the end, that transformation, from desperate gamble to lasting partnership, from survival to prosperity, from loneliness to connection, was worth more than all the coal in Montana territory. Their story had started with desperation and a telegram to Boston. It continued with partnership and shared struggle against impossible odds. And it would extend for decades into the future, built on trust and respect and the practical romance of two awkward people who'd found in each other exactly what they needed, even if it looked nothing like what they'd originally expected. The Walking W Ranch prospered. The coal mine produced fortune, and Catherine and Benjamin Hayes built a legacy together that would outlast them both. Proof that sometimes the greatest victories come not from strength or intimidation, but from intelligence, partnership, and the courage to trust unlikely allies when everything else has failed. In the golden Montana twilight, with coal dust on their hands and success hard-won through suffering, they'd found something neither had dared hope for. Not just survival, but happiness, built layer by sedimentary layer into something solid enough to withstand any storm. And that, in the end, was the greatest fortune of all.